cut open a man's chest with a scalpel borrowed from a tray she wasn't authorized to touch. Blood soaked through her scrubs to the skin underneath. The chief surgeon was screaming her name from across the trauma bay, screaming, "Stop!" Screaming, "You have no right," and she ignored every word because the man on the table had maybe 40 seconds of viable cardiac output left, and she was the only person in the room who knew exactly what to do about it. The monitor flatlined. Her hands didn't shake. She reached inside, found the bleed, and held it closed with 2 fingers while everyone around her stood frozen. Then the doors opened. 3 people walked in, and one of them called her chief. If you've never seen a story like this before, stay right here, because this one will wreck you in the best possible way. Every twist, every moment of justice, every second, this woman fights to be seen. It's all coming. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single episode, and hit that like button before we even get started. And drop a comment below. Tell me your city and country, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, before the blood, before the chaos, to the woman nobody thought was worth watching. The parking garage on Delmore Avenue had been under repair for 11 months. Hartwell Medical Center knew it. The city knew it. The construction company that had been patching the 3rd floor support columns with substandard concrete knew it best of all, because they'd been cutting corners since the contract began and telling themselves it wouldn't matter. Structural problems don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, invisibly, until one Tuesday morning in October, when the temperature drops 6 degrees overnight, the concrete contracts and a support beam that should have been replaced in March finally gives way. The collapse happened at 8:14 a.m. The first ambulance arrived at Hartwell Medical Center in Denton Falls, Nebraska at 8:31 a.m. By 8:33, the ER was already behind. Nora Voss was charting at the nurse's station when the radio crackdown came through dispatch. She heard the words multi-vehicle entrapment, confirmed structure failure, estimate 40+ casualties, and she was already moving before the charge nurse finished repeating it. Not running. Moving, the specific kind of purposeful, unhurried movement that looks calm from the outside and is anything but. She pulled the trauma bay curtains aside and started counting what they had. 2 trauma bays fully stocked, 1 partially restocked from the overnight shift. She opened every cabinet herself, not delegating, running her hands along the shelves the way someone does when done this in the dark before, when counting by feel is the only option. And being wrong means someone dies. She clocked the blood supply, walked to the refrigerator unit, mentally cataloged the O negative. She checked the chest tube kits, checked the airway carts, found 1 missing laryngoscope blade, and replaced it from the backup drawer before anyone else had noticed. It was gone. Voss, the charge nurse, Pam Eckert, appeared at the doorway. "You're supposed to be finishing the McKinley chart. McKinley is stable. We're not going to be stable." Nora didn't look up. "We need to call in the off-shift trauma team. Get 4 more nurses down here from the med-surg floor. And we need someone to start pulling ONEG now, instead of waiting for the first critical to roll in." Pam stared at her. "Dr. Cross hasn't ordered any of that. Dr. Cross isn't down here yet. Then we wait for Dr. Cross." Nora straightened up. She was 32 years old, medium height, with the kind of face that didn't broadcast much steady eyes, a composure that people sometimes mistook for blankness. She'd been at Hartwell for 14 months, transferred in from a hospital in Wyoming that nobody in Denton Falls had ever heard of, with a resume that had gaps in it nobody ever thought to ask about. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight, kept her badge clipped straight, and did her job without complaint or ceremony, which, in this particular hospital, was apparently unusual enough to make people suspicious. "Okay," she said and went back to the cabinet. She kept pulling equipment anyway. Dr. Julian Cross arrived 4 minutes later. He was 51, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of permanent tan that came from weekend golf, and the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong in a room he controlled. He was a good surgeon, technically proficient, fast under pressure, capable of genuine brilliance in the OR. He was also the kind of man who needed to be the smartest person in every space he occupied, which meant he'd spent 22 years making sure nobody around him had the opportunity to outshine him. He walked into the trauma bay and took in the preparations Nora had already made, and something flickered across his face, not gratitude, not acknowledgement, something that looked more like irritation at being anticipated. Who authorized the blood pull? I called it, Nora said. We have a mass casualty inbound. Structure collapse, Delmore Avenue parking garage. 40-plus casualties, estimate 10 to 15 critical. I'm aware of the situation, Voss. Then you know we needed the blood staged before the first wave hit. Cross looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, 2 residents and a fellow had followed him in, watching. In the future, he said, you'll wait for a physician order before pulling blood product. That's protocol. With respect, Dr. Cross, by the time we get a physician order in a mass casualty event, we're already behind the bleeding. The silence that followed had weight to it. You're a nurse, Cross said. Not loudly, almost pleasantly. Act like one. One of the residents, a second year named Garrett Finch, who had never let an opportunity to perform pass him by, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Nora held Cross's gaze for 2 seconds, then went back to work. The first ambulance hit the bay doors at 8:37. Then the second. Then 2 more within 90 seconds. Then it stopped being possible to count. Because the bay doors were just open and the gurneys were rolling in continuously, and the controlled system that Cross had assumed he was canceling had become something that required an entirely different kind of mind to manage. Nora moved through it the way water moves through a narrow channel, not chaotic, not slowed, but finding the path that the current demanded. She assessed by sight before she touched anyone. Airway, breathing, circulation. She'd been doing triage for long enough that it had stopped being a protocol and become something closer to instinct, the kind of rapid recognition that comes from having done it in conditions that had no protocol at all, where the assessment window was the length of time it took to move from one body to the next, and there was no one above you to approve your decisions. She called the priorities without waiting for Cross. Green, yellow, red, black, red not shouting them, just stating them, moving through the bay with a clarity that made the other nurses orient toward her the way water orients toward the lowest point. She didn't notice she was doing it, or rather she noticed she was doing it, and she was careful to stay just below the threshold of visibility. Don't take charge. Let the charge nurse direct. Give Cross his commands back as questions, so he thinks they're suggestions. Do you want me to get the chest tube kit ready on Bay 3? Should I call respiratory for Bay 1? Keep moving. Stay useful. Don't be seen. It'd been her operating mode for 14 months, and it mostly worked. The man in Bay 2 arrived at 8:52. He was 40-something, heavyset, still wearing a construction helmet that the paramedics hadn't been able to get off because of the way he'd fallen. His left femur was fractured, and the bone had broken the skin compound. Bad, bleeding, but that wasn't what was killing him. His blood pressure was 74/40 and dropping. His oxygen sat at 81, and the non-rebreather mask was doing nothing. His neck veins were distended. His trachea was not midline. Nora saw it from 6 feet away. She was at the bedside in 2 steps, stethoscope already out, listening to the left chest. Silence. Total breath sound absence on the left. She pressed 2 fingers against the trachea. Deviated right. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the chest cavity, compressing the heart, collapsing the lung, preventing venous return. He had maybe 2 minutes before the cardiac output dropped below viable. Maybe less. She turned toward the bay entrance. Doctor. Cross. Bay 2. Tension pneumo. I need a needle decompression kit and a chest tube setup. Cross was 20 feet away managing Bay 1. He looked up. Confirmed. Keel deviation, right. Absent breath, sounds left. Sat 81, BP 74/40. Yes. He held up one finger, give me a minute, and went back to Bay 1. The monitor on Bay 2 alarmed. BP 68/35. Nora turned to the tech beside her. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath and a large bore syringe. Now. Dr. Cross hasn't... I know, she held out her hand. Get it anyway. The tech went. Cross appeared at the bay entrance 30 seconds later, which was 30 seconds, during which Nora had positioned herself, identified the landmark second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and was holding the angiocath in her right hand with the cap already off. What are you doing? Cross said. He's going to code in the next 60 seconds. You can do the needle decompression, or I can, but someone has to do it right now. You don't have surgical privileges. I have a needle. She kept her eyes on the patient. His SAT is 78. His pressure is 65. He's about to arrest. Cross stepped forward. She stepped aside and let him take the angiocath from her hand. He hit the correct landmark cleanly. She'd have to acknowledge that he was technically competent, and the hiss of released air was audible across the bay. The patient's SAT began to climb immediately. 79. 82. Then the monitor alarmed again. Not the oxygen this time. Blood pressure. 52/28. He's bleeding. Nora was already at the ultrasound machine, rolling it to the bedside without being asked. I can do a fast exam, Finch. Cross pointed at the resident. Fast exam. Finch took the probe. He was slow about it, not incompetent, just slow. The deliberate, careful slowness of someone who hadn't done enough of these to have made them automatic yet. Nora watched the screen over his shoulder and saw the fluid around the heart before he did. Pericardial effusion, she said. Finch blinked. Looked closer. Yeah. There's fluid in the pericardial sac. Cardiac tamponade, Nora said. She was already looking at Cross. He needs a pericardiocentesis, or he needs to be cracked. Right now. Cross looked at the screen, then at the patient. The patient's eyes had gone glassy, the way eyes go when the brain is running out of blood to think with. BP 44/20. Get him to OR, Cross said. He won't make it to OR. Nora said it quietly, without drama, because it was just a fact. He will code before the elevator. He needs the pericardiocentesis here. Cross looked at her, that flat, measuring look she'd seen from him before, the look that preceded the comment about her being a nurse, about protocol, about acting like what she was. The monitor screamed. The patient flatlined. Cross called for the crash cart. Nora was already doing compressions. Her hands stacked correctly, depth correct. Rate correct. She'd done CPR enough times that her body found the rhythm without her having to count. Finch charged the defibrillator. Cross drew up epinephrine. 2 rounds of ACLS. Epinephrine in. Resume compressions. Check rhythm. Still flatline. Epinephrine again. He's not coming back from this without drainage, Nora said between compressions. The blood around the heart is mechanical obstruction. Drugs won't fix mechanical obstruction. Cross looked at the clock. Looked at the patient. Resume, he said. She resumed. After the 3rd round, Cross looked at Finch, and Finch looked at the floor, and the senior nurse standing at the cart looked at the ceiling, and Nora looked at the patient and felt the specific, focused anger that she had been carrying for 14 months crystallize into something colder and more useful. Compressions. I need a pericardiocentesis needle, she said. Not to Cross. To the tech at the supply cart, who had been watching the entire sequence with wide eyes. Voss Cross said, he has tamponade. We've run 3 ACLS rounds. He has electrical activity on the underlying rhythm strip, which means this is PEA from obstruction, not a primary cardiac event. Drain the pericardial sac, and he has a chance. Don't, and he's dead in the next 60 seconds. She held out her hand to the tech. The needle. The tech looked at Cross. Cross said nothing. The tech looked at Nora. She kept her hand out. The tech opened the drawer and handed her the pericardiocentesis needle. She did it the way she'd done it the first time, which had not been in a hospital. The first time she'd done a pericardiocentesis, it had been in the back of a transport vehicle on a dirt road, with no ultrasound, no monitoring, no sterile field. The man on the improvised stretcher, bleeding from 3 separate wounds, and the team leader telling her she had 90 spents. She had 90 seconds before they hit the checkpoint and couldn't stop. She had done it by landmark and angle and feel, because those were the only tools available. She had done it correctly. This time she had ultrasound guidance and a proper needle and a surgical suite 30 feet away, and it was still the highest stakes thing she'd done inside this hospital. She identified the subxiphoid window on the ultrasound with her left hand, angled the needle at 45 degrees toward the left shoulder, advanced slowly with aspiration, and felt the resistance change the moment she entered the pericardial space. Dark blood rushed into the syringe non-pulsatile. Old blood, hemopericardium, and she aspirated steadily. 20, 30 millers, 40 miller. The rhythm strip changed. P resolved to a narrow complex. Slow but organized. She kept her hand absolutely still aspirating. Watching the monitor, and the rate climbed 30, 48, 62, and the blood pressure materialized on the screen like it had been waiting for permission. 64/40. Not good, but real. The patient made a sound. Not a word, more like a reflex. Air moving through a throat that had been deprived of it. His eyelids moved. Nora exhaled through her nose. The trauma bay was completely silent. She became aware, without looking up, that the silence extended beyond the people directly around her. That the other staff in the room had stopped moving. That Finch was standing with his hands at his sides and his mouth not entirely closed. That the senior nurse at the cart had both hands pressed flat against the counter. Cross was standing 3 feet from her left shoulder, and she could not read his expression because she was keeping her eyes on the patient, watching the pressure, watching the rhythm, but she could feel the quality of his silence. It was different from the silence of the others. Denser, more specific. BP 72/44, the tech called out. Sat climbing 88/91. He needs a surgical window, Nora said. The drain will buy time, but the source of the bleed needs to be addressed in OR. She looked up at Cross. He'll hold for transport now. Cross looked at the patient, then at the needle, still in Nora's hand, still taped in place, still running a slow drain. Get him prepped for OR, he said, to Finch, not to Nora. Finch jumped into motion. The tech moved. The nurses moved. Nobody looked directly at Nora, which she recognized as its own kind of acknowledgement. She stepped back and let them work. Cross found her in the supply corridor 20 minutes later. She was restocking a crash cart, methodical, efficient, going through the checklist in her head before the paper one, because the paper one was slower. You want to tell me what your training is? He said. She didn't stop restocking. I'm an RN with a trauma certification. That's not what I watched back there. Is the patient alive? A beat. He's in surgery. Prognosis is cautiously optimistic. Then the technique worked. She put the epinephrine in. With respect, Dr. Cross, I followed your lead on the ACLS rounds. I made a recommendation when the data supported a different intervention. You took a needle. You didn't stop me. She looked at him then. You could have. You chose not to. He held her gaze and she held his, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. Don't do that again without authorization, he said finally. I hope the situation never requires it, she said. He left. She went back to the cart. By noon, they had admitted 37 patients from the collapse. 11 were critical. 7 had required immediate surgical intervention. 3 of those had been cases where Nora's early preparation, the blood staged, the equipment arranged, The assessments made in the first moments, before anyone was assigned, had made the difference between the patient surviving the first hour or not. Nobody tallied it that way. Nobody had time to tally anything. She moved through the afternoon in the rhythm that mass casualty response required, not sprint, not walk, but the sustainable pace of someone who had learned that you do not spend everything in the first hour, because the last hour will need it too. She checked on the patients she'd triaged. She caught a medication error before it reached a patient. She noticed that a woman in Bay 6 had a wrist fracture that hadn't been documented in the chaos of arrival and flagged it for the orthopedic resident. She did not call attention to any of these things. Finch passed her in the hall at 2 in the afternoon and said, "Nice work this morning," in the tone of someone paying a compliment they weren't sure they meant. She said, "Thank you, Dr. Finch," and kept walking. 3:30, a woman arrived from the late transport group, one of the survivors who'd been trapped in a vehicle in the lower level of the garage, stabilized on scene, cleared for delayed transport. She had a fractured pelvis, a head laceration, and the specific confused stillness that sometimes followed prolonged entrapment, the body in shock, the mind not entirely caught up to the present. Nora sat with her for 4 minutes while they waited for the CT slot. "Am I going to be okay?" the woman asked. Nora looked at her BP, her color, the quality of her breathing. "I think so. The pelvis is going to take some work, but you held together well." "I was in there for almost 2 hours," this woman said. I kept thinking someone was going to come, and nobody was." "People came," Nora said. "Not for me. Not at first." Nora didn't say anything reassuring. It had been true the lower level had been the last area reached, the difficult geometry of the collapse, having trapped the easiest rescues at the top. The woman had been alone for a long time. Saying it was fine wouldn't make it fine. "You made it," Nora said instead. The woman looked at her. "So did you. Looks like it was a rough morning." Nora looked down at her scrubs, which still had blood on them from the pericardiocentesis, from the chest compressions, from 3 other patients she hadn't tracked individually. "It was," she said. At 5:15, Cross held a department debrief in the trauma conference room. 12 people around the table, residents, fellows, attending nurses, techs. He went through the morning efficiently, clinical and precise, attributing the good outcomes to the team, which was the appropriate thing to do and which he did, without apparent difficulty. He did not mention Nora by name. He mentioned the pericardiocentesis as an aggressive early intervention that yielded a positive outcome, which was accurate, and which nobody in the room who hadn't been there would have known was performed by the nurse in the corner rather than the attending physician. Nora sat at the end of the table and listened and said nothing. Finch, to his mild credit, glanced at her twice during that portion of the summary, then looked away. After the debrief, the assistant director of nursing, Sandra Gooch, stopped Nora in the corridor. "Good work today," Gooch said. She said it the way people say it when they mean it, and also when they're building up to something else. "Thank you." There was a concern flagged from earlier about the blood pull before physician authorization. "I'll document my clinical rationale. It's not about the documentation. It's about the pattern." Gooch had the look of someone delivering a message they hadn't written. "Dr. Cross has noted not for the first time that you have a tendency to act outside your scope. I've never acted outside my scope of practice. He sees it differently." Nora looked at her. "The patient I did the early blood staging for Bay 1 arrived at 8:41. He would have coded before we got product into him if I'd waited for the order. The documentation will show that." "I know," Gooch said. "Then quieter, I know, Nora. But you understand my position." "I do," Nora said. "I also understand that 3 patients today survived their first hour because someone prepared for a mass casualty before the attending thought to start preparing." Gooch pressed her lips together. She didn't disagree. He also didn't say anything that would protect Nora if Cross decided to push the issue. "Just be careful," Gooch said. "I will." Nora said. She was in the locker room at 6:40, changing out of the soiled scrubs, when she heard the charge desk radio crackle with something that made her stop moving. Secondary collapse. The rescue crews working the lower garage levels had destabilized a section of the remaining structure. 11 workers trapped, 4 with confirmed critical injuries. 2 of the 4 showing signs of traumatic chest injuries, 1 with suspected tension pneumo, 1 with mechanism consistent with cardiac contusion or rupture. ETA 14 minutes. Nora put her street clothes back in the locker. She pulled on a clean pair of scrubs. She went back to the trauma bay. Cross was already there, and when he saw her walk through the doors, something moved across his face that she couldn't entirely categorize. It wasn't gratitude, she doubted, that was in his vocabulary, directed toward her. It wasn't surprise. It was something more like the face a man makes when he realizes he needs something and resents needing it. Voss, he said. Here, she said. They worked. The 2 critical chest injuries arrived together on separate gurneys, the kind of synchronized chaos that mass casualty events produce, where everything you prepared for happens simultaneously and the preparation either holds or it doesn't. Nora took the right gurney without being assigned it. A woman in her 40s, construction worker, right chest caved in. Paradoxical movement on the right side, indicating a flail chest, sat 83 and dropping. She intubated her. Not requested. Not authorized. She picked up the laryngoscope the moment she saw the airway assessment, unconscious patient, no gag reflex, inadequate respirations, and she intubated her in one pass, clean, confirmed bilateral breath sounds with the stethoscope before the tube was even taped. Cross was 6 feet away on the other gurney, and she felt him look. She didn't look back. The respiratory tech connected the vent. Sat climbed, 79, 85, 91. Good tube, the tech said. She was already moving to the next problem. The second critical patient was a man in his 50s, pulseless in the field, but with oresces achieved by the paramedics' return of spontaneous circulation, fragile and unreliable. His pressure was 50 over palp. The ultrasound showed massive hemothorax, blood flooding the right chest cavity. The lung collapsed. Cross was working on him when Nora moved alongside. Chest tube? She said. Set it up, he said. She had it set up before he finished the sentence. Her hands moved to the supplies in the sequence she'd run 100 times, not the sequence she'd learned in nursing school, which was the formal sterile field protocol sequence, but the faster version, the one you develop when the protocol sequence takes 6 seconds longer than you have. She had the field open, the tube cut to the right length, the trocar ready, before Cross had his gloves on. He looked at the setup, didn't comment on the speed. He put the tube in. Dark blood poured through it 400 milliliters in the first 30 seconds, draining into the canister. Pressure came up 62 over 40, then 71 over 48. He's going to need the OR too, Nora said. Hemothorax that volume. There's likely an intercostal vessel or worse. I know, Cross said, without the edge this time. Just flat acknowledgement. She stepped back. He looked at her, a look that had something different in it, something she recognized but didn't trust, the kind of look that precedes a concession from a man who has never made concessions easily. He didn't say anything. He went back to the patient. By 9 p.m., the second wave was stable enough that the night team could take over. Nora had been in the hospital for 14 hours. She had not eaten since a granola bar at 7 in the morning. She was aware of the hunger only abstractly, the way you become aware of the cold, when you step outside after being in a warm building suddenly, all at once, now that the reason to ignore it was gone. She was writing a note at the nurse's station when she heard the main ER entrance open. She didn't look up immediately. The entrance had been opening and closing all day, staff arriving and leaving, family members being escorted to waiting areas. But the particular quality of footsteps, the cadence, the weight distribution made her look up. 3 people. Civilian clothes, but the wrong kind of civilian clothes. The generic navy and gray that people choose when they're trying not to look like what they are. Wrong posture. Wrong way of moving through an unfamiliar space. Not uncertain, the way civilians are uncertain, but calibrated. Contained. The one in front was broad across the shoulders, late 50s. Hair with close-cropped gray hair and the specific flat attention in his eyes of someone who was cataloging the room and finding it smaller and more manageable than most rooms he'd worked in. He looked at her across the nurse's station. She looked at him. Something at her chest did something. She didn't entirely have a name for not quite recognition, because she'd worked hard for 14 months not to recognize things like this. More like a door she'd thought was sealed, starting to come loose at the hinges. The man walked toward her, unhurried, and the 2 people behind him, one woman, one younger man, flanked him at the precise distance of people who had been in the field together long enough to know each other's movements. He stopped at the station. "I'm looking for someone," he said. Quiet, not performing anything. She held completely still. "Nurse Nora Voss," he said. "That's me," she said. He held her gaze, and she could see the assessment happening, the same rapid inventory she'd been running since she'd spotted them at the entrance, and she knew that whatever he was to, whatever image or record he had in his head, she was matching it. She could see it in the way his expression settled. "My name is Carver," he said. "Colonel Marcus Carver, U.S. Army Medical Command." He said in without reach sought him for a badge, which meant it was either very confident she already knew what he was, or very confident she'd have no reason to question him. He was right on both counts. "We need to talk." From behind her, she heard Cross's voice. Voss, closer than she expected. She turned, and he was at the end of the station, watching, his face carrying an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that wasn't quite authority anymore. "Who are these people?" She looked at Carver. Carver looked at Cross with the polite, absolute blankness of a man who had decided this civilian physician was not relevant to his current task. "Sir," said the younger man behind Carver, the one with the posture of someone just back from somewhere difficult, "we've been looking for Warrant Officer Voss. For mine." "Walsh," Carver said. "Just the name." The younger man stopped. Carver looked at Nora. "Warrant Officer," he said. Cross went very still. Nora felt the word land in the room like something physical. Warrant Officer. Not a nursing title. Not an RN credential. A military rank. A specific military rank that existed at the intersection of technical expertise and field command. The rank of someone who had spent years getting qualified in something specialized enough to put them above the rank and file and below the commission structure, operating in the space where the most difficult and most specific work got done. She hadn't been called that in 14 months. She found she had no idea how to respond to it. So she said the only thing that was true, Colonel. And Cross said, in a voice that had lost something it had started with that morning, "What is going on?" And the door at the far end of the ER opened again. And a 4th person walked in, this one in uniform, carrying a folder, moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who had been sent to deliver something and was going to deliver it regardless of what was in the room when they arrived. And Nora looked at the folder and at the uniform and at Carver and understood that whatever she had built in Denton Falls over the last 14 months, the quiet, the smallness, the invisibility was about to change. The 4th person's name was Specialist Dara Osei, and she was 26 years old and had clearly been awake for longer than that. And she walked to Colonel Carver and handed him the folder without looking at anyone else in the room, which was the particular professional discipline of someone who had been briefed on exactly what she was walking into and had decided in advance not to react to it. Carver took the folder, didn't open it. Cross stepped forward. He had recovered something, not all of it, but enough to make him feel entitled to the space. "This is a hospital. If you need to speak with a member of my staff, you go through administration." You don't walk into my ER, Carver said. He said it with no inflection at all, which was more effective than any tone he might have chosen. Cross stopped. We're not here to disrupt your facility, Carver said. We're here for a conversation that should have happened 14 months ago. He looked at Nora. Is there somewhere we can speak privately? Nora thought about the supply corridor, where the conversation with Cross had happened that afternoon. She thought about the locker room. She thought about the small family consultation room off the waiting area, which was probably empty by now. Family consult room, she said. Down the hall. Lead the way. She walked, and Carver and his people fell into step behind her. And she was aware of Cross watching them go, specifically aware, the way you're aware of something at your back that hasn't made a decision yet about what it's going to do. She didn't look back. The family consult room had 4 chairs, a box of tissues on a low table, a watercolor print of mountains on the wall that was either very cheap or very expensive and impossible to tell which. Nora sat in the chair closest to the door, not because she needed an exit, but because she had spent enough years in rooms like this, different rooms, different configurations, to know that where you sit is a kind of statement. Carver sat across from her. Walsh and Osi positioned themselves near the door, not blocking it, just present. The folder went on the table between Nora and Carver. He still didn't open it. How long have you been going by Voss? He asked. It's my name, she said. It was my name before I enlisted. Your operational name was different. Operational names stay operational. He almost smiled. Not quite, but the muscles around his eyes did something. Fair enough. He leaned back in the chair, which was the kind of chair not designed for leaning back in, and made it look natural. I want to be clear about why we're here. This isn't a compliance visit. Nobody's in trouble. Then why the folder? He looked at it. Because the conversation I need to have with you involves documentation you should see. Your own documentation. He pushed it toward her. Your service record. The unredacted version. She didn't touch it. I know what's in my service record, she said. The redacted version, he said. There's more. She looked at the folder. It was thicker than it should have been for someone who had officially mustered out quietly with an honorable discharge and a handshake. She felt something she recognized as a trap, not because Carver was threatening her, but because information was always a kind of trap, because knowing things committed you to responding to them. And she had spent 4 months building a life specifically organized around not being committed to anything. Before I look at that, she said, tell me what happened today. Brought you here today, specifically. Carver looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at the floor, then back up. We've been tracking your location for about 6 months, Carver said. Not in an intrusive way. That's an intrusive thing, Nora said. You're right. I'll rephrase. He didn't seem rattled by it. We identified your location approximately 6 months ago through routine administrative processes. Your nursing license renewal. It's public record. And you waited 6 months. We were building a case. Not against you. A case for something. He put his hand flat on the folder, not opening it, just resting it there. Today's accelerated the timeline. What happened today? She said again. Word travels, he said, even from civilian hospitals. Especially when the incident involves 37 casualties and a nurse performing emergency procedures that are well outside any civilian scope of practice. The room was quiet. Through the wall, she could hear the muffled sounds of the ER, the intercom, footsteps, a monitor alarm that someone silenced. The hospital going on being a hospital. Someone called it in? She said. No. Someone mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone who had your file, flagged for exactly this kind of thing. He paused. Nora, we've been looking for you for a reason. Not to pull you back in, that's not how this works anymore. But because of what's in that folder, she picked it up. She read it the way she'd been trained to read operational documents, systematically, without reacting visibly to anything, processing each line before moving to the next. The first section was her service record, as she knew it. enlistment, training pipeline, qualification dates, unit assignments. The language was bureaucratic and flat, which was the point of military documentation, to compress extraordinary things into ordinary language so that the paper wouldn't scare whoever had to sign it. The second section was different. It was a series of after-action citations. Not the formal medal citations those she'd received in actual ceremonies, small quiet affairs, with few people present and no cameras. These were the operational reports, the raw ones. The ones that described, in clinical military language, exactly what she had done and where and under what conditions, and which had been classified at a level that meant nobody without the appropriate clearance had ever read them, including her direct supervisors at Hartwell Medical Center, who had apparently received a version of her service record so thoroughly redacted it contained almost nothing useful. She turned a page and read about a mountain pass in a place that didn't have an official name on any map she'd been authorized to see. She read about a convoy and a vehicle and a soldier with a sucking chest wound, and the 14 minutes she'd had between the injury and the point at which the casualty would have been non-survivable, and what she had done in those 14 minutes with what she had available, and the outcome. She turned another page, and another. Walsh, near the door, shifted his weight. She closed the folder. "Why are you showing me this?" she said. "Because the hospital showed us yours," Carver said. She went still. The administration at Hartwell Medical Center filed a complaint with the Nebraska State Nursing Board 4 months ago, he said, alleging a pattern of behavior outside scope of practice, alleging insubordination, alleging concerns about professional judgment. He said, each one without editorializing. Just facts, lined up. The complaint was moving toward a formal hearing, which would have affected your license. She looked at the table. They filed it based on a record that didn't tell them who you are, he said. And we think that's a problem we can fix. If you want it fixed. She sat with that for a moment. The particular kind of sitting with something that isn't passive, it's active, it's just internal. It's the kind of processing that looks like stillness from outside and is anything but. 4 months. The complaint had been filed 4 months ago, and she hadn't known, and the not knowing had been its own kind of answer, because if she'd known, she'd have fought it. And fighting it would have required revealing things she'd specifically chosen not to reveal. The administration had known that. Or not known, it had simply counted on the fact that a nurse with a quiet demeanor and a thin record didn't have the resources to mount a serious defense. Cross filed it, she said. Not a question. Dr. Cross's name is on several of the supporting statements, Carver said. He isn't the only name. Gooch, she said. Carver didn't confirm or deny. Confirmation. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the watercolor mountains on the wall and thought about the woman she'd sat with at 3:30, the one from the garage who'd been alone in the dark for 2 hours. You made it, she'd said. So did you. She had made it. 18 months. Kept her head down, kept her scope tight enough to avoid the formal complaints, navigated Cross and Gooch and Finch's condescension, and the 100 small daily indignities of being a woman in this building who was better at the most important parts of this job than most of the people above her. And she had made it, and they had filed the complaint anyway. What does fixing it look like? She said. It looks like us providing your unredacted record to the nursing board, which makes the complaint not just unsupportable, but actively embarrassing for the people who filed it. He was matter-of-fact about it, not triumphant, just accurate. It also looks like a conversation about what comes next. What comes next, she said. There's a position, he said. Medical command. Not field work, you know. That's not what I'm describing. Training and protocol development. Specifically, combat casualty care training for medical personnel across the Joint Force. It's a civilian contractor position, DoD, utilizes your full qualification profile. He paused. Nobody would be asking you to pretend to be less than you are. The ER sounds continued through the wall. She heard the entrance open and close twice which probably meant another family arriving, another set of faces that needed something from the people in this building. I need to think about it, she said. That's the right answer, Carver said. Take the time you need. He stood, which brought Walsh and OC to attention with the reflexive synchrony of people who'd been in the field together. For now, can I ask what you're doing tomorrow? Scheduled for a 12-hour shift. He nodded. Then we'll talk after. He held out his hand, and she shook it, and it was a firm handshake with nothing performative about it. The kind of handshake that means exactly what it is, and nothing more, and she respected that about him. They left. She sat alone in the room with the mountains for a while, and then she went back to work. Cross was waiting. Not in the corridor that would have been too obvious. He was at the nurse's station, signing off on charts he could have signed off on an hour ago, which meant he'd been there long enough to see Carver and his people leave. His posture said he was doing paperwork. His eyes said he was doing something else. Nora walked to the station to check on the bay assignments for the night handoff, and he appeared at her elbow the way he did sometimes, close enough to make her aware of him. Not close enough to be accused of anything specific. Military, he said. Low, not for the room. Former, she said. What branch? Army. He processed that. She could see him sorting it against the image he had of her, trying to make it fit the way you see someone adjust the aperture. On a lens, the picture doesn't change, but the light does. What did they want? A conversation, she said, about what happened today. Among other things. He was quiet for a moment. She kept her eyes on the bay board. The man from the pericardiocentesis, Bay 2, the first critical of the day, had been moved to the surgical ICU. Status post-op, listed as serious but stable. She'd checked twice, without writing it down anywhere. You should have told me, Cross said. She looked at him then. She let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke, because she wanted to be precise about this. Told you what, specifically? That you had that kind of training. I'm an RN, she said. That's the role I was hired for. My military background wasn't relevant to my job description. It was relevant this morning. This morning I made clinical recommendations. You made the decisions. She held his gaze. That's how it works. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the internal accounting he was doing, tallying what she'd done against what he'd said to her, measuring the gap, not quite willing to name the number he was arriving at. The board is going to have questions, he said, about the scope of what you did today. I expect they will, she said. I'll answer them. He nodded once, slowly. Then he went back to his charts. She went back to the bay board and stood there for a moment, looking at the names and numbers and status codes that represented the day's work. And she thought about the folder and Carver and the mountains on the consultation room wall and complaint that had been building for 4 months without her knowing it. And she thought, all right. The night shift took over at 11. Nora handed off her patients, all of them, in order, with complete verbal and written summaries that the night nurses confirmed were the most thorough they'd seen from a day shift all month, which was not hyperbole, but was the kind of compliment delivered sideways, not directly. She changed. She collected her bag from her locker. She was in the parking lot, 3 rows from her car, when she heard footsteps behind her. Not Carver. She knew Carver's footsteps now. These were different, lighter, faster, the pace of someone who'd jogged a bit to catch up. Finch. He was out of his white coat, in the street clothes that made him look younger than he was. He stopped a few feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets, which was the stance of someone who hadn't decided yet what he wanted to say. Hey, he said, Dr. Finch. Garrett is fine. A beat. Outside the hospital. She waited. I wanted to say, he stopped. Started again. What you did today. With the tamponade. And the intubation in the second wave. I've seen attendings. He shook his head slightly. I've seen attendings with 10 more years of experience not move like that. Thank you, she said. I should have said it in there. In the debrief. His jaw tightened slightly. Cross should have said it in there. He summarized the outcomes accurately. He didn't mention you. He mentioned the team. Finch looked at her. He was 29. She knew from his ID badge, which she'd read during onboarding, the way she read everything. He was at the point in his residency where he was good enough to understand what excellent looked like, but not yet quite there himself, which was a frustrating place to be, and which probably contributed to the edge he sometimes carried. The complaint, he said. She went still. I didn't know about it, he said. Until tonight. Cross mentioned it to the fellow after the debrief. He looked away, then back. I heard it. Okay, she said. I didn't file anything. I want to be clear about that. I know I've said some things. You have, she said. Evenly. Not magnanimously, honestly. Yeah. He had the decency not to deflect it. I want you to know I didn't contribute to the complaint. She studied him for a moment. He was uncomfortable, and he deserved to be uncomfortable. And he was here anyway, which was not nothing. I appreciate you telling me, she said. He nodded. Put his hands back in his pockets. Seemed like he might say something else, then decided against it. He walked back toward the hospital entrance, and she watched him go, and then she walked to her car. She didn't sleep well. This was not unusual. She hadn't slept well in 4 years, which predated her departure from the military and was something she'd mostly made her peace with. She slept in segments, 90 minutes, an hour. She woke at 4 and lay in the dark and reviewed the day the way she used to review operations. Not ruminating cataloging. Identifying the decision points, the outcomes, the variables she'd controlled, and the ones she hadn't. The man from Bay 2 was alive. She kept coming back to that. It was the anchor point, the way the mission objective used to be the anchor point. Everything else was context. Everything else was process. But this was the thing that mattered. She thought about the folder. She thought about the word complaint. And the 4 months it had been moving through the system without her knowledge, and the particular kind of injustice that was not dramatic but was very thorough, the slow administrative erosion of someone's professional standing by people who had decided she was a problem without ever troubling themselves to understand what she actually was. She thought about Cross saying you're a nurse in a tone that meant you're less, and Gooch saying just be careful in a tone that meant I know, but I won't help you. And Finch making a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh, but was aimed at the same place. Then she thought about the folder again, about what was in it, about the pass with no name on any map and the 14 minutes and the outcome. She'd known who she was the whole time. She'd been choosing every day whether to let anyone else know. The question Carver was really asking wasn't, do you want this position? It was, do you want to stop pretending to be something smaller than you are? She didn't have an answer yet, but she was getting one. She was back at Hartwell at 6:45 the next morning. 45 minutes before her shift started, which was her standard time to review overnight charts, check on yesterday's critical patients, reorient to the environment before the chaos of day shift began. She did this every day. Nobody had asked her to. The SICU charge nurse, a veteran named Bess Halverson, who ran the unit with the organized efficiency of someone who had survived 20 years of institutional turbulence by being indispensable, looked up when Nora appeared at the unit entrance. Your guy from yesterday, Bess said, without preamble. Bay 2, Nora said, he's awake. Extubated at 3 a.m., asking for his wife. Something loosened in Nora's chest. Good outcome. According to the surgical team, it's kind of a miracle he made it to OR in a condition compatible with surgery. Bess gave her a look. They found a tamponade in the pre-op notes. Said the drainage in the ER was clean. It was a team effort, Nora said. Bess made a sound that wasn't a laugh, but rhymed with one. Sure it was. Nora reviewed the chart for 10 minutes, then went down to start her shift. The day began ordinarily 3 admits from overnight, a pediatric fever workup that turned out to be nothing serious, a man in his 70s with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal and not cardiac, which was the best possible outcome and which he didn't believe until she explained it twice. She moved through the morning at the usual pace, the mass casualty intensity of yesterday compressed now into the normal texture of an ER day, and she was grateful for the ordinariness of it in the way you're only grateful for things after you've been without them. Cross arrived at 8. He was quieter than usual, not subdued exactly, but the particular quiet of someone carrying something they haven't decided what to do with yet. He reviewed charts, made rounds, conducted himself with technical precision. He did not seek her out. At 10:15, Sandra Gooch appeared in the ER doorway and asked Nora to come to the administrative suite. Not a question, not phrased as one. Nora pulled off her gloves, told the tech she'd be back, and went. The administrative suite was on the 3rd floor, removed from the clinical areas by a carpeted corridor and a set of double doors that made the sound of the hospital disappear. The carpet was beige, the lighting was fluorescent, but softer. The framed prints on the walls were different from the ones downstairs, more corporate, less personal. Gooch was there. The department director, a man named Philip Strath, whom Nora had met once at a staff orientation and not spoken to since, was there. And a woman Nora didn't recognize mid-40s, a good suit, a tablet on the table in front of her. "Thank you for coming," Strath said. He was the kind of administrator who led with procedural courtesy in all conditions. "Please sit down." Nora sat. "This is Renata Burgess," Strath said, indicating the woman. "She's from the hospital's legal division." "Okay," Nora said. Burgess nodded briefly. She had a face that gave very little away, which Nora respected as a professional attribute even under the current circumstances. "We wanted to speak with you about the events of yesterday," Strath said, "and about a related matter that has come to our attention. The complaint that was filed with the nursing board." "I see," Nora said. "We want to be transparent with you." He paused in a way that suggested he was choosing words carefully. "It has come to our attention that the complaint may have been filed based on incomplete information." Nora waited. Specifically, Burgess said, taking over smoothly, the practiced handoff of someone used to legal proceedings. "The hospital was not aware of the full scope of your professional background and qualifications when the complaint was initiated." "I wasn't either," Nora said. "That I was aware of a complaint." A beat crossed the room. Gooch looked at the table. "The military personnel who visited last evening," Strath said. "Colonel Carver, he contacted administration this morning." "Of course he had. He provided documentation," Burgess said, "relating to your service record. Comprehensive documentation." She glanced at the tablet. "If the scope of your training, experience had been known at the time the complaint was filed, it would not have met the threshold for the board. Your actions yesterday were within your actual skill set." "They were," Nora said. Another pause. "The hospital will be withdrawing the complaint," Strath said. Nora let that land. Not with relief, or not only with relief, because relief was too simple for what she felt, which was also something like anger. The anger of someone who'd been forced to go through 14 months of managed smallness, because in this room had decided who she was based on insufficient data and had not thought to look further. "I appreciate that," she said, because it was the professionally appropriate thing to say. "We also wanted to discuss yesterday's events and the scope of interventions performed," Burgess said. "Dr. Cross has provided a preliminary incident report." "What does it say?" Nora asked. Burgess glanced at Strath. "It's still being finalized," Strath said carefully. "Which meant something in it was being negotiated. Which meant something in it was not yet what it needed to be, and the question of what it needed to be was apparently still open." "I'd like to see it when it's complete," Nora said. "That's your right," Burgess confirmed. Strath folded his hands on the table. "Nora, can I call you Nora?" "Of course. We recognize that yesterday was an extraordinary situation, and that the patient outcomes, were positive. Significantly positive." He paused. "We also recognize that the environment you've been working in may not have fully utilized your capabilities." She looked at him. He had the particular expression of someone who has realized they've been part of a problem and is trying to find the least uncomfortable way to acknowledge it without the word apology appearing anywhere in the process. "I appreciate that acknowledgement," she said again. "We'd like to discuss, going forward, what a revised role might look like. Something that better aligns." His desk phone rang. He looked at it with the faint irritation of someone interrupted at a critical moment, then picked it up, listened for 4 seconds, and his expression changed in a way that was visible from across the table. "Tell them I'll be right down," he said. He hung up. He looked at Burgess. He looked at Nora. "There's a situation in the ER," he said. Nora was already standing. She heard it before she saw it. The elevated voices, the overlapping radio calls, the specific rhythm of controlled urgency that meant something had arrived unexpectedly, and the triage system was adjusting to absorb it. She pushed through the stairwell door to the first floor and hit the ER corridor moving. And from 20 feet away, she could see the bay curtains pulled and the cluster of people and the portable monitor being wheeled at speed and the color of urgency that a trauma bay takes on when something is going wrong faster than people are solving it. Cross was there. He was managing. She could see that, the way she could always read the room, but his managing had the quality of someone who was one step behind the situation rather than one step ahead of it, which was the difference between control and reaction. "What is it?" she said to the tech nearest the corridor. "Inter-hospital transfer. Man in his 60s, came in stable, just decompensated." BP's cratering. She was already moving toward the bay. The patient was gray, the specific gray of someone whose cardiovascular system was in the process of failing to maintain perfusion, not quite the gray of someone who had crossed the line, but close and moving closer. His BP on the monitor was 58/30, and she watched it tick down as she stepped to the bedside. The chart in the tech's hand said postoperative day 2, abdominal aortic aneurysm repair, transferred from regional facility for monitoring. She looked at his abdomen. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the chart one more time. "He's leaking," she said. To Cross, to the room, to whoever needed to hear it. "The repair is failing. He's bleeding internally abdomen. Look at the distension. That's not post-op swelling. That's acute hemorrhage." "Ultrasound," Cross said. He'd heard her. He was moving. The probe went on the abdomen. The image came up on the screen. Free fluid. A significant amount of it. Dark, echogenic, the unmistakable appearance of blood where blood was not supposed to be, pooling in the spaces around the abdominal organs in a volume that made the tech next to her inhale sharply. "He needs the OR right now," Nora said. "Right now, if his pressure drops below 50, he might not survive inductions." "I know," Cross said. He was already reaching for the phone. "Or Suite 2, get me a vascular surgeon," the monitor alarmed. BP 44/22. The patient's eyes rolled back. Cross looked at the monitor, looked at Nora. And for the first time in 14 months, he said it without the edge, without the performance, without the architecture of hierarchy that had governed every interaction between them since her first weeks in at Hartwell. At Hartwell. "What do you need?" he said. She was already moving. "Large bore IV, second line now," Nora said. 2 units O-neg running wide open. "Get me a pressure bag on both lines and call a massive transfusion protocol." The tech was already moving. The other nurse in the bay, a day shift RN named Kira, who had been at Hartwell 3 years, and who Nora had always found competent and unflappable, started on the second IV without being asked twice. The blood bank phone was ringing at the desk outside. Cross had the OR on the line. "This is Cross. Need Suite 2 ready in 4 minutes, aortic graft failure, hemorrhagic shock. Patient is a 62-year-old male, post-op day 2. Nora tuned him out, not dismissively tactically. Cross was handling the OR. That was his lane. Her lane was the next 3 minutes, which were the minutes that would determine whether the patient arrived at the OR with a viable circulatory system or did not arrive at all. BP 41/18. She grabbed the ultrasound probe again. The free fluid had increased. Since the image 2 minutes ago, she could see it without measuring. The pool had expanded, which meant the bleed was active and accelerating. The graft had not simply failed, it was unraveling, and the abdomen was filling with blood at a rate that the two IV lines were not going to match without significant pressure support. "Levofed," she said to Kira. "We need to bridge his pressure to the OR." "Do we have a central line?" Kira said. "No time. Push it peripheral, low concentration. Watch the site. We're buying minutes, not hours." Kira glanced toward the bay entrance toward Cross, whose back was turned, still on the OR phone. "He hasn't ordered it," Kira said, quietly, not accusatory, just stating the fact of their situation. "He will," Nora said. Cross turned. "I need a Leveft order, peripheral, 0.12 micrograms per kilo per minute. And I need it in the next 60 seconds, or his pressure is going to be non-compatible with surgical induction." Cross looked at the monitor. "BP 39. "Do it," he said. Into the phone. "Hold on." To Nora ordered. Kira was already drawing it up. Patient made a sound, not a word, something more involuntary. The sound of a body registering a crisis. It didn't have the consciousness to name. His skin was the color of wet concrete. His respirations had become shallow and fast, 12 breaths per minute, trying to compensate for a blood pressure that could no longer sustain adequate oxygen delivery. The lungs working harder because the heart was losing the argument. "He's going to lose his airway," Nora said. "If his pressure drops below 35, his respiratory drive is going to fail." "Or is ready," Cross said. "He'd hung up. We can move in 90 seconds. His pressure is 39. He might not tolerate the move." She said it straight. No softening. "If he decompensates in the corridor, we have nothing. No crash cart positioned, no surgical team, no blood products staged." Cross looked at the bay, looked at the corridor, looked at the patient. This was the calculation. She knew it. He knew it. Kira knew it. The OR was the right, and ever right, destination. The question was whether the patient could survive the journey, and the answer depended on what his pressure did in the next 60 seconds. And nobody in the room could control what his pressure did in the next 60 seconds, except by trying to hold it up with Leveft and fluid, and the specific kind of focused intention that passed for hope in a trauma bay. "Leveft in," Kira said. The monitor updated. "BP 42/24. Climbing, barely, but climbing." "Okay," Cross said. "We move." Fast, they moved fast. The corridor between the ER and the surgical elevator was 40 meters. Nora walked at the head of the gurney, watching the patient's face, watching his chest rise and fall, watching the IV lines and the Leveft drip and the O-neg blood running in the pressure bag. Kira managed the lines. Cross walked alongside with his hand on the bed rail in the way people who don't need to hold on anyway, because movement requires something to do with your hands. The elevator took 22 seconds to arrive. Nora counted. Inside the elevator, BP 44, SAT 91, respiratory rate 16, which was better than the 12 it had been. On the surgical floor, BP 47, still not good, not terrible. The OR doors opened, and the surgical team absorbed the patient in the practiced way of people who had been given enough warning to prepare gowns on, instruments arranged, the anesthesiologist already at the head of the table, with his airway cart positioned. The vascular surgeon, a woman named Dr. Priya Nalan, who Nora knew by reputation and had spoken to exactly once, took one look at the patient and said, "What did we do to get him here?" Meaning, what interventions, what support, and Nora answered her in the precise, compressed language of a handoff that contained everything relevant and nothing that wasn't. Post-op day 2 AAA repair, acute graft failure, estimated blood loss in the ER, approximately 1 to 1.5 liters into the abdomen, 2 units onegin, massive transfusion protocol called Leveft at 0.12 peripheral, Last BP 47 over 28. Last sat 91%. Nalin nodded. Good. Get out so we can work. Nora stepped back. Cross stepped back. The OR doors swung closed between them and the patient, and the corridor outside the suite was suddenly very quiet in the way that corridors outside ORs are quiet removed from crisis, not resolved from it. Cross stood next to her for a moment. Point 12, he said. You know the standing protocol for peripheral levofed? I know the risk of tissue necrosis with extravasation, she said. I also know he had 4 minutes of viable pressure before the OR. I chose the lesser harm. He was quiet. You'd have done the same, she said. Not magnanimously, just accurately. He looked at the OR doors. Yeah, he said. I would have. She went back to the ER. By 1 in the afternoon, the shift had normalized. Not calm in ER is never calm but normalized, back to the baseline rhythm of a busy regional hospital, managing the ordinary emergencies of a mid-sized Nebraska city. The mass casualty patients from the garage collapse were distributed across 3 units, the surgical SICU and the medical floor, and the ones who were going to make it were making it. The one who wasn't a man in his late 60s who had been trapped under a concrete slab for 4 hours before rescue reached him, who had arrived with crush injuries beyond the point of surgical management, had died at 6A. M with his daughter holding his hand, and Nora had been the nurse who facilitated that, who made sure the daughter got in, who made sure the room was as quiet as a room in an ER can be, which wasn't very quiet, but was the best available. She ate lunch at her desk, a sandwich she'd brought from home, turkey on wheat, slightly stale, because she'd made it the night before when she couldn't sleep. She ate it without tasting it and reviewed the overnight charts she hadn't finished reviewing that morning before. Gooch had pulled her upstairs. Carver called at 1:17. She stepped into the supply corridor to take it. How's your morning? He said. Busy, she said. I heard. The aortic case. A pause. Non is one of the best vascular surgeons in the region. He's got a chance. She didn't ask how he knew about the case already. She filed the information instead. Carver had reach inside this hospital that went beyond a single evening's visit, which meant he'd been paying attention to Hartwell Medical Center for longer than 6 months. The administration meeting this morning, she said. You called them? I thought it was time, he said. You could have told me you were going to do that. A beat. Would you have wanted me to? She thought about it. Honestly. No, she said. I'd have tried to talk you out of it. That's why I didn't tell you. She leaned against the supply shelf. The corridor was cool and smelled of antiseptic and cardboard, and the sounds of the ER came through the door at a remove present, but muffled. The hospital's constant undertone. The position, she said. Tell me more about it. He told her. 20 minutes worth. She listened without interrupting, which was harder than it sounded, because what he was describing was good, genuinely good, the kind of work that used what she actually was, rather than requiring her to trim herself down to fit the available space. Protocol development for combat casualty care. Training programs. The kind of institutional influence that prevented the next generation of medics from having to improvise solutions that should have already existed in a manual somewhere. When do you need an answer? She said when he finished. When you're ready to give one, he said. Not before. She said she'd think about it, and she meant it. And they ended the call, and she went back to the ER. The second chart flagged at 2:40. She caught it herself, not from a monitor alarm, not from a nurse's concern, but from the kind of systematic chart review that she did as a matter of habit, reading the overnight notes and cross-referencing the medication records with the documented assessments, the way someone does when they've learned that errors accumulate in the spaces between disciplines, in the handoffs, in the gaps between what one person documents and what the next person reads. The patient was a 44-year-old woman, admitted from the garage, collapsed the previous day with a pelvis fracture and a head laceration, the same woman Nora had sat with in the afternoon. the one who'd been alone in the lower level for 2 hours. Her name was Denise Farrow. She had been medically managed overnight, pain control and pelvis brace and neurochecks, and the morning nurse's note said she was resting comfortably and her vitals were stable. The vitals in the chart did not match the monitor data that Nora pulled up on the secondary screen. Not dramatically, that was the thing about it. Not the kind of discrepancy that announced itself. A heart rate trending upward across 4 hours. A blood pressure trending slightly downward. Within normal ranges, both of them, in isolation. But the trajectory, the direction of travel over time, was the thing that didn't fit the picture of a woman resting comfortably with a stable pelvis fracture. Nora went to the floor. Farrow was awake. She looked tired, the particular worn-out quality of someone who hadn't slept in an unfamiliar place with pain that the medication was managing but not eliminating. She looked up when Nora came in. "You were here yesterday," she said. Nurse. "I am," Nora said. She pulled the bedside chart. "How are you feeling?" "Tired. Sore." Farrow shifted in the bed and made a face. "My stomach's been bothering me. I figured it was the pain meds." Nora looked at her abdomen. She pressed gently palpation, not aggressive, just enough to assess for guarding or rebound. Farrow winced at the right lower quadrant, more than expected for a patient with a pelvis fracture at that location. Nora pressed the left side. Less response. "When did the stomach pain start?" Nora said. "I don't know. Middle of the night, maybe? It's not bad." "I thought it was hunger." "Did you tell the nurses?" "I mentioned it. They said it was probably the morphine." Nora looked at the IV site, looked at Farrow's color, which was not alarming in any single data point, but which had a pallor to it that she didn't like. She stepped into the corridor and called the hospitalist on call. Got a resident, which was what she expected at this hour. "I have a patient on 4, 44-year-old female, pelvis fracture from the Delmore collapse, HR trending up over 4 hours, pressure trending down, new abdominal pain, right lower quadrant, with palpation tenderness. I'm concerned about a missed abdominal injury. Her CT from yesterday's. CT was done at 11 a.m. yesterday, approximately 2 hours post-injury. If she has a solid organ injury with a delayed bleed, the initial CT could have been clear." A pause. The resident was deciding whether to take this seriously, and Nora waited through the pause without filling it, which was a technique she'd learned a long time ago: give people space to arrive at the correct conclusion. Don't force it, because forced conclusions are fragile. "I'll come look at her," the resident said. "I'd also recommend a repeat CT abdomen pelvis with contrast and a hemoglobin check," Nora said. "I'll see her first." "Of course," Nora said. She went back to Farrow's room and stayed there. The resident, a hospitalist second year named Torres, arrived 14 minutes later. She assessed Farrow, reviewed the chart, pressed the abdomen in the same areas Nora had pressed, got the same wincing response from the right lower quadrant. Torres ordered the CT. She also ordered the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin came back first, 7.2. Yesterday's admission, hemoglobin had been 10.4. Torres looked at the result, looked at Nora. "She's been bleeding somewhere since admission," Nora said. "I see that," Torres said. "A beat. Good catch." Nora stayed with Farrow until transport arrived for the CT, which took 20 minutes, and during which Farrow asked what was happening with the quiet directness of someone who had survived 2 hours trapped under concrete and was not going to be gentle about not knowing things that affected her. "We think you may have a small internal injury that didn't show up on the first scan," Nora said. "We're going to check. Am I going to need surgery?" "I don't know yet. Possibly." Farrow pressed her lips together. "Okay," she said. Not resigned, decided. The way people who've already been through the worst available thing in a day decide to absorb the next bad thing. "You caught it," Farrow said. "You came up here, and you caught it." "It was a team effort," Nora said, which was partially true and partially the reflex of someone who had learned not to claim things directly. Farrow looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. I saw how you were yesterday. In the ear. I was watching from the gurney. Nora didn't say anything. Thank you, Pharaoh said. Plainly, without theater. Transport arrived, and Nora let them take her. The CT showed a grade 3 splenic laceration with active extravasation. Small, but not static, the spleen was bleeding, slowly and steadily, and it had been bleeding since sometime in the night, and without intervention, it would eventually bleed enough that the slow trajectory of rising heart rate and dropping pressure would become something faster and less reversible. Nalin, who was out of the OR by 3:15 and apparently incapable of leaving the hospital on a day that kept producing surgical cases, took Pharaoh to the OR at 4. The repair was laparoscopic, clean, and the prognosis was excellent, and when Torres found Nora at the nurse's station later that afternoon, she said, "She would have coded tonight," and Nora said, "Probably," and Torres said, "You should have been a doctor," and Nora looked at her and said, "I'm exactly what I should have been." And Torres seemed to think about that for a moment before nodding and moving on. Cross found her at 5. She was documenting. End of shift charting, the administrative work that constituted the final act of every shift regardless of what the shift had contained, filling in the record with the information that would outlast the day. That would become the permanent account of what had happened and what had been done. She was thorough. She was always thorough. Cross pulled a chair to the other side of the station and sat down in a way that said he wasn't going anywhere quickly. She kept charting. "The incident report," he said. "The one being finalized?" she said. "I've been revising it." He put his hands on the desk. He wasn't looking at her, looking at the station surface, at the pen in his hand. "I want you to see it before it goes to the board." She stopped charting and looked at him. He slid a printed page across the station. She picked it up. It was a clinical incident report, formatted with the hospital's standard documentation headers. It described the events of the previous day, the mass casualty response, the specific interventions during the tamponade case, the second wave chest injuries, with a precision and accuracy that she recognized as genuinely his, because whatever else Cross was, he was clinically precise. And it attributed the interventions to her by name. Not as the team, not as collective action, by name. Nora Voss, RN, identified tension pneumothorax prior to physician assessment and recommended appropriate intervention. Following physician-performed needle decompression, Voss identified cardiac tamp via clinical assessment and performed emergency pericardiocentesis with successful result. Voss subsequently performed emergency intubation of a second critical patient during the second wave response. In both cases, the clinical decisions were correct, the execution was technically proficient, and the patient outcomes were directly improved by her actions. She read it twice. The last paragraph, it is the assessment of this purporting physician that the existing scope of practice complaint filed against Voss should be formally withdrawn, and that her clinical contributions to yesterday's mass casualty response warrant institutional recognition. Specifically, I am recommending review of her credentialing toward advanced clinical privileges consistent with her documented training and demonstrated capability. She put the page down on the station. "Why?" she said. He didn't misunderstand the question. "Because it's accurate," he said. "The first incident report you were building wasn't accurate." "No." He said it straight. It wasn't. She looked at him. He looked back. He looked tired, not physically tired, though he was that too, but tired in the way that comes from having carried something that has some weight to it. "The complaint," she said, "the one to the nursing board." "I was wrong," he said, not elaborating it, not building a case for himself around it. Just the 3 words. She let them sit. "I'll review it," she said, meaning the incident report. "I'd want your corrections," he said. "If anything's inaccurate, I'll let you know." He stood, picked up the pen. He was halfway to the door when she said cross. He stopped. "The complaint didn't happen because you didn't like my technique," she said. It happened because you needed me to be smaller than I am. And that had nothing to do with me. He stood with his back to her for a moment. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the specific configuration of a man absorbing something that has hit the right place. I know, he said. He left. She went back to charting. At 6:15, Carver appeared in the ER entrance. Not the full contingent this time, just him, and Walsh at a respectful distance, and the folder which he'd brought again. He didn't approach the nurse's station immediately. He stood near the entrance, and she saw him from across the bay, and for a moment they simply occupied the same space without moving toward each other. Then she saved her chart, logged off the workstation, and walked over. The aortic patient, Carver said. Nalan says he'll likely survive. Good, she said. Pharaoh, the splenic lac. He paused. You caught that. Someone was going to catch it. But you caught it today, he said, before it became a different kind of problem. She crossed her arms, not defensively, just the posture of someone who is listening and waiting. I have something I need to tell you, Carver said. It's professionally. It's the part of this conversation I've been building toward since last night, and I want to be straight with you about it, because I think you've had enough people in this building not being straight with you. Go ahead, she said. He opened the folder to a page she hadn't seen the night before. A different section, not the citations, not the operational reports. Something with a different header, a more recent date. When your unit was deactivated 3 years ago, he said, there was an internal review. Standard procedure for unit stand-downs. During that review, an anomaly was identified in the after-action reports from the last 18 months of operations. She went still. Specifically, he said, there were medical interventions during 3 separate interventions that resulted in positive outcomes that were attributed in the official record to the assigned flight surgeon, Dr. Elliot Ware. She looked at the page. She recognized the mission designations. Those interventions weren't performed by Ware, Carver said. The review established that. The specifics of who performed them, the technique, the decision-making matched your profile and your training exactly. Ware was present, but he was not the operator. She didn't say anything. Ware took credit, Carver said, in the official record, for procedures you performed under conditions that were. He paused, chose his words. Not easy. The review found this. What happened to Ware? She said. Her voice was steady. She'd had 3 years to feel things about Ware, and she'd done most of that feeling already, alone, and what was left was something colder and more factual. He was quietly reassigned, Carver said, which was wrong, which is part of what I'm here to correct. Reassigned, she said. That's being revisited, he said. The review findings are being elevated. What happens to Ware is above my pay grade, but it's not going to stay quiet. He looked at her directly. Your record is being corrected. The procedures are being attributed to the correct operator, which means 3 additional citations in your service file, 2 of them significant. She looked at the page in his hand. She looked at the ER behind her Kira, at the nurse's station, a tech wheeling a patient toward imaging, the monitor in Bay 3 showing a rhythm she'd have to check before she left. How long did you know, she said. The review completed 4 months ago, he said. It took time to build the full picture, to identify where you were. 4 months, she said. The same 4 months the nursing board complaint had been building. The same 4 months since she'd been showing up at 6:45 every morning to a hospital where she was performing at a level nobody recognized and being reduced, people who hadn't bothered to look at her actual record. I know the timing is Carver started. Don't, she said. Quietly. Don't explain the timing. He closed the folder. She stood in the entrance of the ER in Denton Falls, Nebraska, with the evening light coming through the glass doors at an angle that made the linoleum floor look like something it wasn't. And she felt the particular combination of vindication and grief that comes from finally being handed the truth of something you'd been carrying alone for a long time. It wasn't relief. Relief was too simple. It was more complicated than relief. It had sharp edges to it, and weight, and the very specific anger of realizing that the people who should have acted sooner had not. Carver let her stand there. He didn't fill the silence. She respected him for that. The position, she said finally. Still on the table, he said. I have conditions. He waited. The Ware situation gets fully resolved. Not quietly. On the record. I'll push for it, he said. The complaint to the nursing board gets formally withdrawn with a record of the withdrawal. Already in motion. And I want to see the corrected citations before I sign anything. You'll have them by tomorrow morning. She nodded. Looked at the ER one more time. Looked at the evening shift nurses, taking their positions, the familiar choreography of a place that didn't stop. I need a week, she said. You have it, he said. He left, and she stood for another moment, and then she went back in. She was at the nurse's station, finishing her final chart when the overhead page came through. Not a code, a different kind of call. The administrative tone that preceded non-emergency announcements. She heard her name and looked up. The charge nurse, Pam Eckert, was standing at the far end of the station with the phone in her hand and an expression that Nora could not read from the distance between them. Not distress, not urgency, something else. Something that made Pam look like she'd been told a piece of information that had rearranged something in her understanding of the last 14 months. Voss, Pam said. Call for you. Administration line. Tell them I'll call back in. It's not the hospital, Pam said. It's the nursing board. Nebraska. A pause. They said it's urgent. Nora looked at the phone. She looked at the chart, half finished, the cursor blinking in the documentation field, where she'd stopped mid-sentence. She thought about Carver, saying already in motion, and she thought about the folder, and she thought about the 4 months of the complaint moving through the system in a direction she hadn't known about. She walked to the far end of the station and took the phone from Pam. This is Voss, she said. The voice on the other end said her name, and then said the name of the board investigator assigned to her case, and then said something that made the base of Nora's throat go tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She listened without speaking for 40 seconds. Then she said, "Can you repeat that last part?" The investigator repeated it. Nora looked at the nurse's station at Pam, who was trying not to visibly watch, and at Kira across the bay, and at the board with its names and numbers, and the room assignments of the 50-odd patients currently under the care of this hospital, people who had arrived broken and were being put back together by people who showed up every day and did the work, regardless of whether anyone understood the full weight of what they were carrying. The investigator was still talking. "I understand," Nora said. "Yes, I'll be available." She handed the phone back. Pam looked at her. Good news or bad news? Nora thought about how to answer that. She thought about what the investigator had said. She thought about what the investigator had said, not just the withdrawal complaint, which she expected, but the second part, the part she hadn't expected, the part that had made her ask for it to be repeated. The board had received a formal request, not just from Carver's documentation. From a second source, independent, filed this afternoon. A physician at Hartwell Medical Center had submitted a formal statement to the nursing board recommending that the complaint be not merely withdrawn, but expunged, erased from the record entirely, as though it had never been initiated on the grounds that it had been filed in bad faith against a clinical practitioner whose qualifications, had they been properly known, would have made the complaint impossible to sustain. The physician's name on the statement was Julian Cross. Pam was still watching her. "I'm not sure yet," Nora said. She went back to her chart. She finished the chart. It took 11 more minutes because she was not going to let a phone call, even that phone call, make her sloppy about documentation. She filled in the remaining fields with the same systematic precision she'd applied to everything else that day, saved the record, logged off the workstation. and sat for a moment in the particular stillness that follows a shift that has taken more than it should have been able to take. Pam was still at the far end of the station, not watching. Being professional about not watching, which was its own kind of watching. Kira had gone to check on a patient in Bay 4. The evening team was settling in. The ER had exhaled into its nighttime rhythm, quieter in the specific way that hospitals are quieter after dark, which is not actually quiet, but is a different frequency of noise. Nora picked up her badge from the station surface where she'd set it, clipped it back to her scrub top, and walked to the locker room. She sat on the bench for a few minutes without doing anything, just sitting. The locker room smelled of laundry detergent and hand sanitizer and the faint metallic undertone that hospital spaces always carry. The fluorescent light above the third row of lockers buzzed at a pitch slightly higher than comfortable. She had noticed that buzz on her first day and had never mentioned it to anyone, which seemed like a small but accurate summary of her 14 months at Hartwell. She changed. She put her scrubs in the laundry bin, pulled on her jacket, sat back down on the bench. Cross had filed a statement, not just an incident report with her name on it. A formal submission to the Nebraska State Nursing Board, independent of any administrative directive, advocating for expungement. She knew what that cost a physician in a small hospital, the informal politics of it, the way it would read to the people above him, the way Philip Strath would see it, the way it would follow Cross in the whisper networks of institutional hierarchy that determined who got the favorable call schedule and who got the difficult review committee assignments. He had done it anyway. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She'd spent 14 months understanding who Cross was, and what she'd understood was correct. It hadn't stopped being correct just because he'd filed one statement. People were complicated in ways that didn't resolve cleanly, and she'd been in enough difficult situations to know that a single right action didn't erase a pattern, but it also wasn't nothing. She put on her jacket, picked up her bag, and left. The morning came the way mornings do after bad nights, not differently, not with any particular mercy, just with light and cold air and the specific requirement to function. She was at her kitchen table at 6 a.m. with coffee she'd made too strong, and the corrected citations Carver had sent to her email at 5:47. She read them straight through. 3 documents, formal military language, each one describing a specific event on a specific date in a specific location, attributing the medical actions taken to warrant officers, Nora Voss, with the notation that the original record had contained an error and was being corrected pursuant to the findings of the internal review. Error, the military's word for what Ware had done. She noted the word and set it aside. She'd deal with the feeling of that word later. Right now she was reading for accuracy, not for justice, and the accuracy was intact. The facts of what had happened and what she had done were correctly recorded, and the names were correct, and her name was where it belonged. She forwarded the documents to the email address the nursing board investigator had given her the previous evening. Then she sat with the coffee and the quiet for another 20 minutes before she got dressed and drove to work. Hartwell looked the same from the parking lot. It always did. Buildings didn't change their faces based on what was happening inside them, which was either reassuring or not, depending on the morning. She badged in at 6:40, walked to the nurse's station, pulled up the overnight charts. The aortic patient, the man from the inter-hospital transfer, was in the surgical ICU, 24 hours post-op, listed as guarded but stable. Nallen's note from the morning described the repair as technically successful, the prognosis as conditional on the next 72 hours. Farrow's post-op note from the laparoscopic repair was better she was awake, tolerating liquids, pain-controlled, expected discharge in 2 days. Nora noted both without writing anything down and went to prep for the day shift. Gooch appeared at 7:15. Sandra Gooch was 58 years old and had been in nursing administration for 19 years which meant she had survived more institutional upheaval than most people in this Bildungsbeitnist, and had done so by being reliably aligned with whoever held the power that controlled her position. This was not unusual. It was the specific survival strategy of a particular kind of person in a particular kind of institutional structure. But it meant that Guch's loyalty, directiony, was directional rather than principled. And Nora had understood that within the first month. "Morning," Guch said. She had a coffee in her hand and a specific quality of careful neutrality on her face. "Morning," Nora said. "I heard from the board," Guch said. "So did I. The withdrawal is official." A pause. "The expungement request is under review. They typically take 60 days. "I know the timeline," Nora said. Guch looked at her. Whatever she was building toward, she was building toward it slowly. "I also wanted to say, regarding my role in the complaint process." "Sandra." Nora kept her voice even. "We don't have to do this right now." "I think we do." "Okay," Nora said. She waited. "I was aware that the complaint was being built on a record that wasn't complete," Guch said. She said it carefully, each word placed with the deliberate care of someone who has thought about the sentence for a long time. "I could have asked questions I didn't ask. I didn't." "Why?" Nora said, not hostile actually asking. Guch looked at her coffee. "Cross carries a lot of weight in this department. He has for a long time. When he decides something, it's like the path of least resistance is to let it go. And I was the path of least resistance. Yes." Guch didn't dress it up. "I'm sorry." Nora looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the 14 months, the pattern of small accommodations, the managed invisibility, the way she had calibrated herself daily to stay below the threshold of visibility. Because she'd understood without being told that being visible meant being targeted. She thought about the months the complaint had been running before she knew it existed. "Okay," she said, "that's it? What else would you like me to say?" Guch seemed to be waiting for something anger maybe, or the specific absence, specific that comes when someone accepts an apology in a way that lets the other person feel better. Nora wasn't in a position to offer either, and she wasn't going to perform them. "I appreciate you telling me directly," Nora said. "Counts for something." She went back to work. At 9 a.m., Philip Strath called an emergency department leadership meeting. The notification went out to Cross, to the department director of nursing, to the trauma service chief, and unexpectedly to Nora. She saw her name on the distribution and read it twice before accepting the calendar invite. The meeting was in the third-floor administrative suite at 10. She arrived 2 minutes early and found Cross already there, sitting at the far end of the table with a posture that was controlled and said nothing. Strath was next to a woman Nora didn't recognize, late 40s. Gray blazer, reading from a tablet, and Burgess was back. Same good suit, same face that gave very little away. The woman with the tablet turned out to be Eleanor Vance from the hospital's governing board. Not the administrative board, the oversight board, the one above Strath, the one that handled issues of institutional liability and professional standards. Nora sat down and understood that this meeting was not, as the calendar had described it, a leadership check-in. Vance Lessett. She was precise and unhurried, which was the particular quality of someone who did not need to perform urgency because she had actual authority. "We've been reviewing the events of the past 48 hours, Vance said, including the mass casualty response, the clinical interventions performed, and the subsequent documentation issues relating to the nursing board complaint." She looked at no one in particular. "I want to be direct. The board's review has identified several concerns." Strath's expression was neutral and tight, which was not its usual configuration. "The first concern," Vance said, "is the complaint itself. The documentation trail shows that the complaint was initiated following a clinical incident report that contained factual misattributions interventions attributed to the department as a collective that were, in fact, performed by a specific clinical staff member." She glanced at the tablet. "Voss." In at least 4 documented instances over the past 14 months, similar misattributions appear in the formal record. Nora sat very still. This was new. Not just the pericardiocentesis, not just yesterday 4 instances. Someone had gone back through 14 months of Hartwell documentation and found the pattern. The second concern, Vance continued, is the process by which the complaint was developed. The board's governance standards require that complaints to external licensing boards be reviewed by administration prior to submission, including verification of factual accuracy. She looked at Strath. The documentation indicates that review step was not completed. Strath said there was time pressure involved in minutes. There wasn't, Vance said. Flat. No energy wasted on it. The complaint was filed 3 months after the first incident report was drafted. There was sufficient time for review. Cross was looking at the table. Dr. Cross, Vance said. He looked up. Your incident report from yesterday, the revised one, is noted. The board is treating it as a corrective submission, not as mitigation for the original complaint. She paused. The distinction matters. I understand, Cross said. Do you want to say anything on the record about the 4 prior instances? A silence descended that had weight and texture. Cross's jaw moved slightly. He looked at Nora not with the measuring look of a man performing authority, but with something different, something that had less architecture to it. The record reflects what I reported at the time, he said. What I reported at the time was incomplete. Incomplete, Vance said. Yes, deliberately, the longest pause yet. Nora watched him work through it, watched him arrive at the place where the honest answer and the self-protective answer diverged, and watched him choose. Yes, he said. The word sat in the room. Vance made a note. Burgess made a note. Strath looked at a point somewhere above the window. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. At its conclusion, Vance outlined the board's preliminary findings and the actions that would follow, and she did it in the same measured, unhurried way she'd done everything else, the specific cadence of someone who has learned that delivering consequences clearly is more effective than delivering them dramatically. Cross would be placed on a formal performance improvement plan, the first in his 22 years at Hartwell. The plan would include mandatory review of documentation standards, a supervised clinical period of 90 days, during which a second attending would co-sign his incident reports, and a formal letter of reprimand in his personnel file that would remain for a period of 3 years. The department director of nursing, the position above Gooch, would be tasked with a full review of the past 14 months and also 15 months of ER documentation for additional misattributions. Any findings would be corrected in the permanent record. Nora's personnel file would be updated to reflect her complete military qualification profile, which Carver's team had provided to the hospital the previous afternoon. The scope of practice complaint would be withdrawn with a formal notation that it had been filed in error. And Vance said this last. The hospital would open a formal credentialing review to assess whether Nora's existing position accurately reflected her training and capabilities. That process typically takes 60 to 90 days, Vance said. We'd like to begin it with your consent. Nora looked at her. You have it, she said. Vance nodded. Then we're adjourned. People gathered their things. Strath left first, which was the move of a man who needed to be somewhere else quickly. Burgess followed. The woman Nora didn't recognize, another board staffer, followed. Cross stood slowly. He picked up his pen from the table and put it in his coat pocket and straightened his coat in the particular way that people straighten things when they need their hands to do something while their minds are doing something else. He looked at Nora. For whatever it's worth, he said, I'm glad he lived. He meant the man from Bay 2, the first critical, the tamponade. So am I, she said. He left. She sat alone in the administrative suite for a moment. The watercolor mountains were on the same wall. She looked at them for a beat longer than she needed to, and then she stood and went back downstairs. The news moved through the hospital the way news moves through hospitals, quickly, informally. in the specific osmotic way of institutions where people spend 12-hour shifts in close proximity to each other and have long since stopped pretending that professional information stays in professional channels. By noon, the ER staff knew that Cross was on a EP. By 2, the surgical floor knew. By 3, Nora had been stopped 3 times by colleagues she had never had substantive conversations with, each offering something in the vicinity of support, without quite being able to commit to the word. Kira caught her in the supply corridor, the same corridor where Gooch had warned her to be careful, where Cross had told her she was a nurse, where she had gone to take Carver's call the previous afternoon. Heard about the meeting, Kira said. News travels, Nora said. For what it's worth, and I know it's maybe not worth much. At this point, I should have said something a long time ago. About the documentation. About the way things were being attributed. Nora looked at her. Kira was 36, had been at Hartwell for 7 years, was competent and careful, and until yesterday had been someone Nora had respected for her clinical skill without knowing much else about her. You didn't cause it, Nora said. No, but I watched it. Kira wasn't letting herself off easy. I watched it, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I kept doing that for 14 months. Yeah, Nora said. That's all I wanted to say. Okay, Nora said. And then, because it was true, thank you. Kira nodded and left, and Nora stood in the corridor for a moment, thinking about what it cost people to say things they should have said sooner, and what it cost the people who had waited for them to say it, and whether those two costs could be weighed against each other in any meaningful way. She decided they probably couldn't. It was sufficient that it had been said. Finchen found her at 3:30. He was in his white coat between patients, and he stopped at the nurse's station with the abruptness of someone who has made a decision and is executing on it before he can reverse it. The 4 instances, he said. She looked up from the chart she was reviewing. What about them? One of them was mine. He said it at the same volume as everything else, which took something. 14 months ago, a patient came in, chest pain, and you flagged a rhythm strip that I'd misread. You told me what you saw. I went to Cross with it as my own finding. He wrote it up that way. She remembered. The patient had been a 41-year-old man with an early Wellens syndrome pattern, a specific ECG finding that predicted a critical lay occlusion, subtle enough to miss if you didn't know exactly what you were looking for. She'd flagged it in 7 seconds. Finch had looked at it for 3 minutes before seeing what she showed him. The man had gone to the cath lab in time. I know, she said. He blinked. You knew? I knew at the time. You never... What would I have said? She kept her voice level. You were a second-year resident, and Cross was your attending. I was a nurse who'd been here 6 weeks. He stood there with the particular look of someone whose retroactive self-counting has arrived at a number they don't like. Patient survived, she said. That was the point. That's very... He stopped. I was going to say forgiving, but that sounds condescending. It's practical, she said. The patient was the point. He still is. Finch nodded slowly. He seemed to be recalibrating something, doing the kind of internal arithmetic that produced visible processing in his expression. He was not a bad person, she'd known that about him for a while, but he was a person who had been in an environment that rewarded certain behaviors, and had performed those behaviors without examining them closely, which was ordinary human failing in a specific institutional wrapper. I told the board, he said, about the ECG, this morning in writing, that I would confirm the documented attribution was incorrect. I know, she said. I saw the supplemental submissions list. He looked at her. He shook his head slightly. You're not surprised by any of this. I'm surprised by some of it, she said honestly. Not by the facts. By some of the people. He seemed to understand she meant him, and Cross, and perhaps others. Okay, he said. He picked up a chart from the station, his original reason for stopping, probably. For what it's worth, I'll be better at this. She believed him, partially. She gave it partial belief, which was the honest proportion. I know, she said. At 4 o'clock, Carver called. She took it at the nurse's station, because she had stopped taking his calls in the supply corridor, which had been a habit of concealment she no longer needed to maintain. Where, he said. She waited. The review findings were submitted to the Army Inspector General this morning. Formal review, not administrative. It's on the record. She processed this. An IG referral was not a quiet reassignment. It was a documented investigation with a process and defined consequences, the kind of thing that followed a person through every subsequent file, every subsequent review, every subsequent position. What are the potential outcomes? She said. Reduction in rank is likely. Forfeiture of some retirement benefits is possible, depending on what the investigation establishes. He paused. He'll know by end of day that it's been filed. She looked at the bay board, the patient's names, the room numbers, the status codes, the ongoing work of the place. Okay, she said. How are you with that? She thought about it. Not the answer she'd give him, the actual answer. She thought about the mountain pass with no name on the map, and the 14 minutes, and the 14 months after them, and the folder, and the 4 misattributed incidents, and Ware's name on procedures she had. Performed while he stood in proximity and took the credit. I'm okay with it, she said. And then I wanted more. I'm okay with what there is. That's honest, Carver said. It's the only thing I know how to be, she said. I know, he said. And then the position. Whenever you're ready, I told you I needed a week. You did. I'm not pressing. I'm just a pause. The first pause she'd heard from him that had any uncertainty in it. I want you to know it's real. The position is real. The value of what you'd bring to it is real. I'm not saying any of this because I owe you something. I know, she said. Oh, Carver. She stopped. Then, thank you for the IG referral, for pushing the record correction, for not letting it stay quiet. It shouldn't have been quiet to begin with, he said. No, she said. It shouldn't. They ended the call. She checked on the Bay 2 patient at 5. He was in the surgical ICU, room 4, sitting up approximately 30 degrees in the bed with the specific, fragile alertness of someone who has been unconscious for portions of the last 48 hours and is still reassembling their sense of where they are. His name was Robert Salter. She'd learned it from the chart. She hadn't used it before now because she'd been the R nurse, and in the chart is the person until they become a person. He had a wife the chart noted next of kin, a woman named Margaret, who was listed as present and who was, in fact, sitting in the chair to his left with a coffee cup, and the specific exhausted vigilance of someone who has been maintaining watch for longer than sleep allows. Nora knocked on the open door. Salter looked up. Margaret looked up. I was your nurse in the ER, Nora said, day before yesterday. I wanted to check on you. Salter looked at her for a moment in the slow way of someone for whom the events of 2 days ago were still organizing themselves. I don't remember much, he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. From the ER. That's normal, she said. Your body was doing other things. They told me he stopped, cleared his throat. They told me someone in the ER, before surgery, that it was close, she said. He nodded slowly. Margaret's hand had moved to his arm. Thank you, he said. She'd heard those words twice in 2 days, from Pharaoh, from Salter, and they landed differently each time, not because the words were different, but because the people saying them were different, carrying different versions of the thing they'd nearly lost and hadn't. I'm glad you made it, she said. She meant it the way she always meant it, specifically, not generically. This man in this room, with his wife's hand on his arm and his rough voice and his imperfect memory of the worst 2 days of his life. Me too, he said. She left them alone and went back to the floor. The shift ended at 7. She did the handoff, collected her things, was in the parking lot by 7:20. The evening was cold, a proper October cold now, the kind that had teeth in it. That meant the winter Nebraska specialized in was getting serious about arriving. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. Not dramatically. She wasn't given to dramatic pauses, just sitting in the quiet of the car after a day that had had very little quiet in it, letting the accumulated weight of the past 48 hours settle into something she could carry more efficiently. Her phone buzzed, not a call, a text, from a number she'd seen in her phone for 14 months but never received a message from, because in 14 months of working alongside each other, she and Cross had never exchanged text messages. There had been no context in which it would have been appropriate. She opened it. It said, "Board forward advances findings to the credentialing committee. Review is confirmed, not pending." They moved faster than expected. She read it twice. "Then I recommended expedite." She put the phone in her pocket, started the car, drove the 11 minutes to her apartment in the particular way that people drive familiar routes, was thinking, without being fully aware of the turns, the body having memorized the sequence. She was putting her key in the apartment door when her phone rang. The number had a Virginia area code. She recognized the prefix, not the specific number, but the prefix, which she associated with a very specific administrative apparatus that didn't usually call at 7:30 on a weeknight. She answered. "Warrant Officer Voss," said the voice. Not Carver. A woman's voice, older, with the particular precision of someone who uses rank as punctuation. "My name is Brigadier General Alana Merritt. I'm the Commanding General of Army Medical Command." Nora stood in the hallway outside her apartment with her key in the lock. "General," she said. "I've been briefed on your situation," Merritt said. "Fully briefed. I want to be direct with you because I think that's what the situation deserves." "I appreciate that," Nora said. "The IG referral on Ware is proceeding. I want you to know that I am personally tracking it and that the outcome will not be quiet." A pause. "I also want you to know that the position Colonel Carver discussed with you, the medical command training role, was originally proposed at a level below what I believe is appropriate given your actual record." Nora's hand was still on the key. "What level were you considering?" she said. "Senior Program Director," Merritt said. "Not contractor. Full staff, with rank reinstatement." Another pause. "Warrant Officer 3, with back pay calculated from your date of discharge." The hallway was very quiet. "That's a significant difference from what Carver described," Nora said. "I know," Merritt said. "Carver didn't have the full picture when he spoke to you. He does now." Her voice was even and deliberate. "I'm not asking for a decision tonight. I'm asking you to sit with this." "I will," Nora said. "There's one more thing," Merritt said. Nora waited. "The program you'd be directing," Merritt said. "It's not just training protocol development. It's a redesign of the entire combat casualty care qualification system. Joint force, multi-branch. The people who go through it will be the medics and flight surgeons and combat nurses for the next 20 years. She paused. "We want the person who built that to be someone who knows what that work actually looks like. Not theoretically, actually." Nora was quiet for a moment. "And Carver thought you were that person," Merritt said. "I read your file and I agree with him." "I'll sit with it," Nora said. "Good. I'll call again in a week." The call ended. Nora unlocked the door and went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, without turning on the light. The apartment was dark, except for the orange cast of the parking lot, light through the window, and she sat in that half-light for a while and thought about the past 48 hours and the past 14 months and the mountain pass with no name and the folder and Salter's rough voice and Pharaoh's directness, and the cost of the choices she'd made, not just the choices in the ER, but the choice to come to Hartwell in the first place, the choice to be small, the choice to let 14 months pass before anything forced the question of who she actually was. Then she thought about Cross's text. "I recommended they expedite. FWW." She picked up her phone and typed back, "Received. Thank you." She put the phone down. She sat for another moment. Then she got up, turned on the light, and went to make dinner, because she hadn't eaten since the granola bar at 7A. M and 2 days of institutional reckoning did not actually exempt a person from the requirement to eat, which was one of the things she had always appreciated about the body's honesty. It kept its own accounting. It didn't wait for resolution. She was standing at the counter when the phone buzzed again. Not a call, an email from the Nebraska State Nursing Board, timestamp 7:44 p.m. The subject line, case file NB 2024-847, formal notice of expungement approval. She read it standing at the counter in the kitchen light, and when she finished reading it, she put the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a moment looking at the wall, and she felt the specific sensation of something that has been pressing against you for a long time, finally releasing. Not all at once, but cleanly, like a door that has been stuck finally swinging on its hinge. The board had expedited. Cross's filing had done something she hadn't expected it to do. Not just supported the withdrawal, but accelerated the expungement, because a licensed physician's formal statement describing bad faith in the complaint's initiation carried enough institutional weight to move the timeline from 60 days to 48 hours. She looked at the phone on the counter. She thought about calling Carver. Then she thought about the call from Merritt and about what Merritt had said and had not said, and about the specific phrasing, the program you'd be directing, and the weight of that phrase, which was not hypothetical. She picked up the phone. She did not call Carver. She opened her email and scrolled back to the original message from Merritt's administrative aide, which had arrived while she was in the car and which she'd clocked and not read yet. And she opened the attachment in it, a 2-page document, official letterhead, Army Medical Command, and she read it carefully. The second page had a signature block, General Alana Merritt, as expected. And below it, a second signature block she had not expected. The name above it was one she recognized. Not from Hartwell, not from Carver's file. From before. From the mountain pass. From the unit. The name was someone she'd served with for 3 years. Someone whose casualty she had managed on the worst night of that rotation. Someone she had believed she would never speak to again because the entire unit had scattered when it was deactivated, and the people in it had gone their separate ways into the silence that classified operations produce. The name was there on the second signature block of an Army Medical Command document, which meant that person was still active, still inside the system, still connected to Merritt's office, and had co-signed the offer. She read the name twice. She sat down. Her dinner was uncooked on the counter, and her phone was in her hand. And the parking lot light was still orange through the window, and she sat at the kitchen table in the light from the overhead bulb and understood that the thing she had thought was simply a job offer was something more complicated than a job offer that someone from her actual past, and from the part of her past she had sealed 14 months ago, had reached into the present and put their name on a document that had her name on it, which was not nothing. Which was, in fact, the opposite of nothing. She put the phone down on the table. She looked at the wall, and for the first time in 48 hours in 14 months, she did not know what she was going to do next. The name on the second signature block was Petra Halvorsen. Nora sat with that for a long time. The overhead light in the kitchen did not change. The parking lot light through the window stayed orange. The uncooked dinner stayed on the counter. None of the physical facts of the room shifted to accommodate the internal shift happening in the person sitting at the table, which was how it always worked. The world maintained its indifference while the people inside it reorganized. Petra Halvorsen had been a special operations flight nurse, team lead, 3 combat rotations before the unit was deactivated. She'd been the one in the transport vehicle on the night of the mountain pass. She'd been the one who'd said 90 seconds and meant it and had held the vehicle in position for exactly that long. Not a second more. Not because she was ruthless, but because she understood the arithmetic of survival, in conditions where the arithmetic was the only honest thing. Nora had performed the pericardiocentesis, the first one, the real one, and Halvorsen had driven them out. They had not spoken since the deactivation. Nora had not looked for her. She had not looked for anyone from the unit, because looking for them would have been a way of staying connected to the part of herself she'd decided to set down. And she'd needed to set it down the way you need to set down something heavy, not because it's worthless, but because you can't carry it, and also carry yourself. She looked at the signature for a third time. Petra Halvorsen, CW4, Special Operations Medical Liaison, Army Medical Command. Still in, still active, co-signing documents in Merritt's office at 7:40 in the evening. Nora got up and cooked her dinner. Eggs and toast, because it was what she had, and because the act of cooking something simple and edible was a way of staying in the present instead of the past, which was where she'd been living in her head for the last 10 minutes. She ate at the counter. She washed the pan. She did these things deliberately, with the specific deliberateness of someone who has learned that the present moment requires maintenance. Then she picked up the phone and called the number at the bottom of the document. It rang twice. Halvorsen, said the voice, same voice. 14 months and 3 combat rotations, and apparently a desk job in Virginia hadn't changed it. It's Voss, Nora said. A pause. Not long less than 2 seconds, but the quality of it was the specific quality of someone absorbing a thing they'd been expecting and not quite letting themselves expect. Hey, Petra said. Hey, Nora said. Another pause. Your name is on a document, Nora said. I know. I put it there. A brief sound that might have been something close to a laugh. I've been tracking your nursing board situation for 3 months. Merritt didn't know about Hartwell until I told her. Nora stood very still. You told her? Someone had to, Petra said. You weren't going to. This was accurate, and Nora didn't argue it. Why? She said instead. Because I was there, Petra said. On the mountain, in the vehicle. I know what you did that night, and I know whose name was on the report afterward, and I've been carrying that for 3 years. A pause. When I found out where you were and what was happening with the complaint, I wasn't going to stay quiet about it. The kitchen was very still. You could have called me, Nora said. Would you have picked up? A long moment. I don't know, Nora said honestly. That's why I went to Merritt instead, Petra said. I wasn't going to give you the option to tell me to leave it alone. Nora sat down at the table again. She looked at the place where her plate had been, the ring of moisture from the glass she'd had with dinner. Small evidence of a small ordinary meal in an ordinary kitchen at the end of a day that had been neither small nor ordinary. The program, she said. The training redesign. It's real, Petra said. It's not a courtesy offer. Merritt has been trying to staff it for 8 months and hasn't found anyone she'd trust with the full scope of it. A pause. I suggested you. She read your file and stopped looking. You've been busy, Nora said. I've had 3 years to feel bad about how things ended, Petra said. I figured I'd do something useful with it. They talked for 40 minutes. Not about the position, the specifics of that could wait, but about the unit, about the deactivation, about the 3 years since. Petra had stayed in because she didn't know what else to do with herself, which was honest in the way that Petra had always been honest, without softening it. Nora had left because she did know what to do with herself, but had misjudged how much of herself she could actually set down without consequences. They didn't resolve anything in those 40 minutes. Resolution wasn't the point. The point was the call itself, the fact of 2 people who had shared something extreme and had then not spoken for 3 years, deciding to speak again, which was difficult in the specific way of things that require you to be in a different place than you were before. I'll call Merritt, Nora said when they were winding down. I'm not saying yes or no tonight. I know, Petra said. I'm not asking you to. But I'm not saying no, Nora said. A pause. That's something. It is, Nora said. She meant it. She slept better that night. than she had in 4 years. Not well, she didn't do well, but better. The segments longer and the waking moments quieter. And when she came fully awake at 5:30, she lay in the dark for a few minutes and noticed that the thing she'd been carrying in her chest, the low-grade, compressed weight of a person performing a smaller life than the one they were built for, was lighter than it had been yesterday morning. Not gone, lighter. She got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the 2-page document, and read it again in the morning light. Then she called Carver. He picked up on the second ring. 6 a.m. She suspected he was already at a desk somewhere. "Merritt called me last night," she said. "I know," he said. "She told me this morning. Why didn't you tell me about the senior director level?" "Because I didn't know about it until Merritt reviewed the file herself," he said. "I came to you with what I had. When she upgraded it, she called you directly. She accepted this. It was consistent with what she knew of him, that he operated from the information available to him and didn't pretend to more." "Halverson," she said. "A beat. She brought you to Merritt's attention," he said. "I brought your location to the command's attention. We had some overlap. You knew about Halvorson." "I knew she'd flagged your situation," he said. "The co-signature was her decision. I thought it was a good one." Nora looked at the document, at both signatures. "It was effective," she said. "I know," Carver said, and she could hear the not-quite smile in it again. "I'm going to accept," she said. Silence. The specific silence of something landing. "Okay," he said. "Quiet. No performance. I need to give the hospital proper notice. 30 days minimum." "Understood. Merritt will want to meet in person before you start. There's a site visit to the training facility in Maryland she'd like you on. We can time it around your transition." "That works," she said. "Nora," he said. A pause. "For what it's worth, I think you're going to do something significant with this." "I hope so," she said. Not modestly, honestly. She didn't know yet what significant looked like from the inside of a program she hadn't built yet. She knew what the work was. She knew she was the right person for it. What it would become was still open, and she was making her peace with the openness of it. She submitted her notice to Hartwell Human Resources at 9 and walked the paper copy to Gooch's office herself, which was the professional thing to do, and which gave her a last opportunity to say what needed to be said in a direct way rather than through the mediation of documents. Gooch read it, looked up. Something crossed her face that wasn't surprise exactly, but was in the vicinity of it. "Military," Gooch said. "Medical command?" Nora said. "Training program." Gooch nodded slowly. She stopped. "That's a significant role." "Yes," Nora said. Gooch put the paper down carefully. "I'm sorry it took this long," she said. "For the record to be corrected." "I know," Nora said. She'd already had this conversation in one form or another, with several people in the past 48 hours, and she knew its shape by now, the apology, the receiving of it, the space afterward where absolution was wanted, but wasn't hers to give, on a timeline she hadn't chosen. "I hope the next person doesn't have to wait 14 months, Nora said. "That part's yours to fix." Gooch looked at the paper. "Yes," she said, "it is." The formal consequences for Cross came through on day 4. The performance improvement plan was documented, signed, and entered into his personnel file. The department leadership meeting, where it was formally presented, included Vance, Strath, and 2 members of the medical staff executive committee who had been briefed on the full scope of the documentation issues, not just yesterday's incident reports, but the 4 prior cases, the pattern across 14 months. Cross sat through it without deflecting. She knew this because Kira was in the building when it happened and told her afterward, not with satisfaction. Kira wasn't the type for satisfaction at another person's difficulty, but with the specific, careful accuracy of someone reporting a fact they thought was important. He didn't argue any of it, Kira said. Not once. "Good," Nora said. The committee asked him directly whether the complaint to the nursing board was filed with knowledge that Voss's record was incomplete. He said yes. Nora had not known that part was coming. She absorbed it. On the record, she said. On the record, Kira said. In the formal minutes. Nora thought about what that meant. Not the legal or institutional weight of it. She understood those dimensions. They were clear. She thought about what it cost a man like Cross to say yes in a room full of his professional peers on a document that would follow him, about something he had done that he knew was wrong. He thought about the architecture of that decision, the number of smaller decisions that had preceded it over 14 months, the moment on day 2 when he had asked, "What do you need without the edge?" The incident report with her name on it, the statement to the nursing board. She was not going to forgive him for what he'd done. That wasn't on the table and wasn't the point. But she was going to let it be complicated because people who do real harm are not always people who feel nothing about it. And the fact that Cross had felt something was not redemption, but it was information. And she'd always dealt better with accurate information than with the simplified version. "Anything else?" she said. "Finch is being formally counseled for the ECG incident," Kira said. "It's not a PIP level, just documented in his file." But he asked for it. He went to the committee himself. Nora looked at the bay board. "I know," she said. "He told me." "Did he?" "Yesterday. He came to find me specifically." Kira was quiet for a moment. "He's going to be a good doctor," she said. "Eventually." "I think so too," Nora said. She spent her last 2 weeks at Hartwell doing the work. Not differently than she'd always done it, the same 6:45 arrivals, the same systematic chart reviews, the same careful transitions between patients. She did not coast. She did not treat it as a wind down. The patients in the ER on those 2 weeks deserved exactly what the patients in the ER on her first week at Hartwell had gotten, and she gave them that. On her second-to-last day, she went to the SICU and checked on Salter. He had been moved to the step-down unit, which was progress, and when she found him, he was sitting up fully and eating a hospital tray with the particular institutional beige food of recovery, which he was eating with the focused appreciation of someone who had recently understood what it meant not to be able to eat. "You're leaving," he said when she told him. "In 2 days," she said. He looked at her in the considering way he'd had since she first came to check on him, assessing, in the way that some people have, the gap between what a person says and what they carry. "Good," he said. "I mean that. Go do whatever the bigger thing is." She almost smiled. "That's the plan. How'd they treat you here?" he said. "Really?" She thought about how to answer that accurately. "It got better," she said. "Eventually." "Eventually isn't good enough," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." She left him with his tray and his step-down unit room and the view of the parking lot through the window, which was not a good view, but was better than no window. And she walked back to the ER for the second-to-last time. On her last day, Cross came to find her at 6:50 a.m., before the shift properly started, before the floor had its full complement of staff. He found her in the supply corridor, which was either deliberate or coincidental, and she wasn't to spend time parsing which. He looked tired. Not the functional tired of a long shift tired in the way of a man who has been doing sustained internal accounting for 10 days and hasn't arrived at a total that makes him feel better. "Last day," he said. "Yes," she said. He had his hands in the pockets of his white coat, which was the same stance she'd first noticed on him 14 months ago. Arms contained, posture controlled. The container held something different now. Not smaller, just different. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "What I did the complaint, the documentation I've been thinking about why." He stopped. Started again. "I knew what you were within the first month. I could see it, and I spent 14 months making sure you couldn't see that I could see it, because..." He stopped again. His jaw was tight. "Because it was easier to manage you as a problem than to manage myself as someone who was threatened by a nurse." She stood with that. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her. And it was honest in the specific way that honesty is hard not because the words were difficult, but because they pointed at something true about the speaker that the speaker had to be willing to look at. "Thank you for saying it," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm not." He shook his head slightly. "I know what the record looks like. I know what I put in it. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear it," said plainly, not managed. She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had told her she was a nurse, as though it settled something, who had taken her work and attributed it elsewhere, who had filed a complaint against her based on a record he'd known was incomplete, and who had also, in the end, put his name on a statement that cost him something and sat in a room full of peers and said yes when asked if he'd known. "People don't usually change," she said. "Not fundamentally. But they can be better at specific things if they decide to be. I intend to be," he said. "Good," she said. "The department needs that." He nodded. He left the corridor. She stood there for a moment with the antiseptic smell and the cardboard boxes and the buzzing fluorescent light that was still buzzing at the same slightly wrong pitch it had buzzed at for 14 months. And she felt something complete itself, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just quietly, the way a circuit closes when the last connection is made. Then she went to work. The shift ended at 7 p. She handed off her last patient, a man in his 50s with a kidney stone who was now comfortable and medicated, and mildly embarrassed by the amount of noise he'd made on arrival, to the night nurse, with a complete and thorough summary, because that was how she had always done it, and because there was no version of her last shift at Hartwell that ended with her doing less than the job required. She went to the locker room. She changed. She put her badge on the shelf inside the locker and looked at it for a moment, the small, laminated rectangle with her name and her photo and the Hartwell Medical Center logo, and then she picked it up and put it in her bag because she intended to give it back to HR on her way out and not leave it here like something she'd forgotten. She walked the long way out. Not sentimentally, practically. She had rounds to close mentally, the same way she'd always done her last walkthrough at the end of a shift. She passed Bay 2, which had a different patient in it. Now, a young woman with an arm fracture who was calm and reading on her phone, the bay bearing no visible evidence of what had happened in it 10 days ago. She passed the nurse's station, where Kira was settling in for the evening, who looked up and said, "Travel safe," and meant it. She'd passed the corridor where Gooch had warned her to be careful. She passed the family consult room with the watercolor, mountains. She pushed through the double doors to the main entrance and walked across the lobby and through the automatic exit doors and out into the Nebraska evening, which was cold and clear and smelled of the particular clean, nothing that cold air smells of when there's no weather coming. She sat in her car. She thought about 14 months of arriving before anyone else and leaving after most people and doing the work without claiming it. She thought about the specific cost of that, not the obvious cost, the professional one, but the personal one, the daily practice of making yourself smaller than you are, which is not actually neutral. It has weight, it accrues. It becomes a habit so familiar that you stop noticing you're doing it until someone calls you by a rank you'd set down, and something in you answers before you can decide whether to. She thought about Petra's voice on the phone. Someone had to. You weren't going to. She thought about Salter's Good. Go do the bigger thing. She thought about the mountain pass with no name and the 14 minutes and the outcome. And she thought about the training program in Maryland that didn't exist yet in its final form, that she was going to help build from the problem outward, starting with the specific knowledge of what it actually looks like when the protocols fail, when the equipment isn't there, when the qualified person in the room isn't the person with the title, and someone still has to make the decision. She knew exactly what that looked like. She'd spent 3 years in places where it looked like that, and 14 months in a hospital where it looked quieter, but was, in some ways, the same requirement to act correctly under conditions that weren't designed to support you, the same necessity of doing the work regardless of whether anyone was ready to see it done. The difference was that someone had seen it now. And the other difference, the one she was still making her peace with, was that she had needed to be seen. She had believed, for a long time, that not needing recognition was a form of strength. She had been partly right about that, and mostly wrong. The strength was real, but the person who performs without ever being recognized is not transcending need they're managing it, at a cost, and the cost compounds. And eventually the compound is the thing that determines whether they're still standing when the recognition finally arrives. She was still standing. That was the thing she came back to, sitting in the car in the dark parking lot with the hospital lights at her back. She had not been destroyed by 14 months of strategic smallness. She had been diminished. Some she was honest enough to know that, but the core of the thing that had made her effective in a mountain pass with no name and in a trauma bay in Denton Falls, Nebraska was intact, and it was going to Maryland. And it was going to be used for something that mattered in ways that extended beyond any single patient on any single day. She started the car. She drove. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, she walked into the Army Medical Command Training Facility in Fort Detrick, Maryland, with a badge that had her name and her rank on it. Warrant Officer Voss, W3, Senior Program Director. And she found the room where the initial design meeting was being held, and she sat down. And Petra Halvorsen was across the table from her for the first time. In 3 years, and they looked at each other for a moment with the specific, complicated recognition of two people who have shared something extreme and have come out the other side still intact, which is not guaranteed and is not nothing. Ready? Petra said. Been ready, Nora said. The meeting started. The work began. There is a specific kind of person who survives by disappearing, who learns to compress themselves into the available space, to hand their best work to the room without signing it, to watch someone else receive the acknowledgement for what they built in the dark alone. This person exists in hospitals and in office buildings and in combat zones and in every institution where the architecture of power decides who gets to be visible. What happened to Nora Voss was not a story about one arrogant surgeon or one corrupt medical record. It was a story about what it costs a person to be systematically unseen and what it takes to be found. It takes someone who goes looking. It takes someone who refuses to stay quiet when they know what's true. It takes sometimes a parking garage collapsing on a Tuesday morning and 40-plus casualties, and a monitor flatlining and a decision made in the space between what you're authorized to do and what the moment requires. And it takes the person in question to still be there when it happens. To not have already been ground down to nothing by the daily work of performing invisibility. She was still there. That is the thing that mattered. Not the vindication, though the vindication was real, and the consequences for Cross were real, and the expungement was real, and the corrected record with her name in the right places was real. All of that was real and necessary and good. But the thing underneath all of it was simpler and harder. She had not let them make her into what they said she was. She had kept accurate knowledge of herself in conditions specifically designed to erode it. She had shown up at 6:45 every morning for 14 months with the understanding that the work was the point, that the patients were the point, that the moment required whatever the moment required, regardless of whether anyone in the room understood who she was. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the only thing, the whole thing, from the beginning to the end. You do not need permission to know your own value. You do not need an audience to do the work correctly. You do not need someone to hand you back the credit before the credit becomes real. The credit was always real. The question was only ever whether the record would eventually catch up to the truth. In her case, it did. Not because the system worked. The system did not work. The system filed a complaint against her in the dark and let it run for 4 months and attributed her procedures to other people's names for 14 months and required a colonel with a folder and a general with a phone call and a flight nurse. with a co-signature and a surgeon with a crisis of conscience before it arrived at the correct accounting. The system did not work. The people in it eventually did. And Nora Voss, who had buried the warrior in herself because carrying it had become too heavy, and who had found out in a trauma bay on a Tuesday in October that you cannot bury what you actually are, only delay the moment when the world sees it. She walked into a building in Maryland and started building the thing that would mean the next generation of medics didn't have to learn what she'd learned the way she'd learned it, in the dark, alone, under conditions not designed to support them. She was going to change the conditions. That was the job. She was already doing it,